Deadbeat, barren, washed up, divorcee, the black sheep. The words burned in blinding white font across a 15-foot projection screen. 200 of Colorado's wealthiest guests sat at their linen-draped tables, holding their breath for half a second before the Aspen Resort Ballroom exploded into cruel, synchronized laughter. I sat completely still at table 18. The heavy scent of roasted pine and expensive gardenias hung in the air, mixing with the heat of the swinging kitchen doors directly behind my chair. At the head table, my sister Harper adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet and leaned into her microphone. Her voice dripped with fake sweetness. "Don't have a meltdown, Clara. It is just a joke. Lighten up and do not ruin my day." My mother Susan sat next to her, swirling her Chardonnay with a practiced, pitying smile meant for the crowd. My father Thomas slapped the table and chuckled. "Can you not take a joke, kiddo?" This was not a wedding reception. It was a public execution. It was a carefully choreographed trap designed to put the family scapegoat exactly where they thought she belonged, at the bottom. I did not cry. I did not run out of the room. I reached into the pocket of my tailored charcoal suit and pulled out my phone. The glass screen felt cold and solid against my thumb. I opened a secure message thread to Marcus, my chief operating officer, and typed a single word: execute. The room was about to go so quiet you could hear the snow hitting the glass pavilion outside. What happened next did not just stop the party. It permanently erased my family from Colorado high society. Welcome to Luke Vengeance. Before we get into exactly how I dismantled their fake empire piece by piece, hit that like and subscribe button, but only if you genuinely connect with this kind of justice. And drop a comment right now. How old are you, and have you ever been forced to smile while your own family humiliated you? My name is Clara West. I am 34 years old, and I live in Boulder. To understand how I ended up sitting next to the kitchen doors, staring at my own medical trauma broadcasted on a giant screen, you have to rewind exactly 3 months. For the past 6 years, my family told everyone in their country club circle that I was a glorified IT help desk clerk who barely made rent. They loved the narrative. It made them feel superior and successful. The reality was something entirely different. I am the founder and CEO of WestGrid Cyber. It is a cybersecurity firm valued at $45 million. I kept my wealth a total secret because I knew exactly what Thomas and Susan saw when they looked at me: a bottomless ATM. The illusion finally cracked on a Tuesday afternoon in early October. I was at my office desk reviewing a complex firewall architecture when my private cell rang. Thomas was on the caller ID. He never called me to ask how my day was going. He only called when he needed to make a withdrawal. I answered and kept my voice perfectly flat. "Clara," he said, skipping any polite greeting. "Harper needs $50,000 for her Aspen venue deposit by tomorrow morning, or they lose the date." I pressed my fingernails into my palm. $50,000 for a party, while I was supposedly making an entry-level salary. I told him I did not have that kind of money lying around. The silence on the line grew thick. Then Thomas deployed his favorite weapon. His voice dropped to a low, menacing register. "That is a shame, Clara, because I am doing some digital spring cleaning on the old family server today. It would be a real tragedy if your grandfather's final voicemails accidentally got permanently deleted." My stomach dropped. Those audio files were the last time I ever heard my grandfather tell me he was proud of me. The only pure, unconditional love I had ever known in that house was trapped on a hard drive Thomas controlled. It was a calculated, cruel extortion. I wired the money that afternoon, telling myself it was simply the cost of preserving a memory. But my background is in data security. I do not just write blind checks. I track them. And the routing number on the wire confirmation I received 24 hours later did not belong to a luxury Aspen resort. It belonged to a ghost LLC registered to my future brother-in-law. The name on the routing trace blinked back at me from the glow of my monitors: Sterling Innovations Holdings. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair and let the cold reality wash over me. The $50,000 had not gone to a luxury Aspen resort holding a date for my sister. It had vanished directly into a shell account controlled by Harper's fiancé, Julian Sterling. Julian was the family's shiny new golden boy. He drove a leased slate-gray Porsche that he parked diagonally across 2 spaces in my parents' driveway. He wore tailored suits that looked expensive but lacked the bespoke stitching of real money. At every Sunday dinner, he talked over everyone, loudly pitching his disruptive tech startup to anyone who would listen. He threw around Silicon Valley buzzwords like machine learning and scalable blockchain synergy without ever explaining what his software actually did. My parents adored him. To them, Julian was everything I was not. He was loud, confident, and supposedly destined for a 9-figure buyout. Whenever I sat quietly at the end of the dining table eating my roast chicken, Susan would point her fork at me and say, "Clara, you should take notes from Julian. He is actually building a future, while you reset passwords for a living." I never corrected her. I just took another bite of chicken and watched Julian smirk. 2 weeks after the extortion wire cleared, my phone rang again. Thomas. I answered on the second ring. "Clara," he barked, "I need you to do something useful for once. Julian is getting ready for a massive Series A funding round next month. He needs a basic IT sweep of his software architecture just to make sure there are no bugs. I told him you could do it this weekend. For free, obviously." I stared at the city traffic moving silently on the street far below my window. "You want me to audit an entire software platform for free?" I asked. "It is family," Thomas snapped. "You should be honored to help your sister's future husband build his empire. Just log in and fix whatever little glitches he has. Do not make a big deal out of it." I agreed. Not because I cared about family loyalty, but because my instincts were screaming that Sterling Innovations Holdings was a house of cards. I wanted to see exactly what $50,000 of my extorted money had purchased. That Friday night, I poured a cup of black coffee and booted up my secure terminal. Julian had emailed me a set of temporary administrative credentials. They were ridiculously weak. His password was his own last name followed by the number 1, a beginner mistake that told me everything about his operational security. I bypassed his basic firewall and entered the development environment. I expected to find sloppy code. I expected to find half-finished architecture or stolen open-source templates. I did not expect to find a massive federal crime sitting in plain sight. It took me exactly 12 minutes to trace the foundational algorithms. The code was elegant. It was highly sophisticated and beautifully structured. It was also completely stolen. Julian had not written a single line of this architecture. He had lifted the entire proprietary framework from a defunct competitor called Apex Data Solutions. Apex had gone bankrupt 2 years prior, but their intellectual property was still heavily protected by aggressive non-disclosure agreements and corporate patents. Julian had ripped their core framework, stripped out the original copyright tags, and slapped his own branding over the interface. It was not just lazy, it was severe corporate espionage. It was a felony. I did not send an email. I printed the source code analysis, put the pages into a manila folder, and drove straight to my parents' house in the Denver suburbs. I found Thomas and Susan sitting on their leather sofa drinking imported wine. I dropped the folder onto the glass coffee table. The loud smack made Susan flinch. "What is this, Clara?" she asked, rubbing her temple, like my presence was giving her a migraine. "That is Julian's software," I said, keeping my voice entirely level. "He did not build it. He stole it from a dead company. If he tries to pitch this to legitimate investors during his funding round, he will be hit with a massive lawsuit. The SEC will investigate him. He is a walking legal liability." Thomas slowly picked up the papers. He did not understand the lines of code, but he understood my tone. For a second, I thought I saw panic flash behind his eyes. Then Susan stepped in to rewrite the narrative. She set her wine glass down and let out a sharp, condescending laugh. Oh, please, Clara, listen to yourself. You are making up wild accusations because you cannot stand to see your sister happy. I am showing you digital forensics, Mom. He committed corporate theft. Susan stood up and smoothed her expensive cashmere sweater. You are just bitter. Your own marriage fell apart because you could not give your husband children. You are barren and alone, and now you are trying to sabotage Harper because she found a successful man. You are pathetic. The words were meant to gut me. They hit the air like thrown rocks. A few years ago, that comment would have sent me running for the door in tears. But today, I just looked at her. I saw a woman so desperate for high society status that she would rather protect a criminal than listen to her own daughter. Dad, I said, turning my focus away from Susan, you need to pull Harper out of this wedding. Julian is broke. The venue is not even paid for. I checked the routing number on the $50,000 you forced me to send. It went straight to Julian. Thomas dropped the folder back onto the glass table. His face flushed a dark, angry red. He refused to meet my gaze. I know where the money went, Clara, he muttered defensively. The room went entirely still. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway suddenly sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. You know I asked. Thomas puffed out his chest, trying to regain his authority. I did not pay the venue. Julian told me he needed a bridge loan to cover his final development costs before the big investor meeting. He offered me a 10% equity stake in Sterling Innovations. It was a brilliant financial move. That $50,000 is going to turn into $5 million. You would not understand because you just fix computers. I stood in the center of their plush living room, letting the absolute absurdity of his confession wash over me. My father had extorted his own child using the memory of my dead grandfather. He then took that money and funneled it directly into a fraudulent tech scam orchestrated by a con artist who leased his lifestyle. They thought they had brilliantly outsmarted a naive help desk clerk. They were completely blind to the reality of the situation. I did not argue with them. I did not scream or demand my money back. I simply nodded, turned around, and walked out the front door. The crisp mountain air hit my face as I walked down the driveway toward my car. My parents thought they had secured their golden ticket to elite wealth. They had no idea that I already ran a background trace on the upcoming investor meeting Julian bragged about. I knew exactly who he was pitching his stolen software to next week. His primary target for the Series A funding round was a massive global logistics corporation, the exact same corporation that happened to be Westgrid Cyber's largest and most fiercely loyal client. And I was the sole security consultant hired to verify their vendor contracts. Let me take you deeper into the mind of a cybersecurity CEO who just realized her family is running a financial syndicate. When I got back to my vehicle, I did not start the engine right away. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the leather steering wheel. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of my parents' neighborhood. I thought about Harper. My younger sister was 28 years old and had never worked a real job in her life. She spent her days curating her social media feed, buying designer handbags on my father's credit card, and treating service workers like garbage. Did she know Julian was a fraud? Or was she just as delusional as Thomas and Susan? I pulled out my phone and opened her public profiles. Every recent post was a masterclass in aggressive bragging. Pictures of the leased Porsche, pictures of Julian pretending to type on a laptop at a high-end coffee shop. The captions were always the same. Building an empire with my genius future husband. So blessed to leave the toxic haters behind. The toxic hater was obviously me. I locked my screen and finally started the engine. The drive back to Boulder took 45 minutes. During that time, I mapped out every possible variable. If I exposed Julian to the authorities right now, my parents would play the victim. They would spin the story to their country club friends, claiming the unstable, jealous sister filed false police reports to ruin the wedding. The social circle would rally around them. Susan would thrive on the sympathy. Thomas would figure out a way to hide the financial losses. They needed to feel the consequences publicly. The destruction of their fake empire had to happen on a stage they built themselves. When I walked into my apartment, I went straight to my home office. I booted up my secondary encrypted terminal. I needed absolute leverage. I pulled up the upcoming vendor schedule for my major corporate client. There it was. Sterling Innovations Holdings was officially listed on the calendar for a pitch meeting next Thursday at 10 in the morning. Julian was walking right into my territory. He was bringing stolen algorithms to a company that paid me millions of dollars specifically to detect stolen algorithms. I opened a secure chat with Marcus. He was probably asleep, but he always kept his alerts active for me. Marcus, I typed, pull the Apex Data Solutions copyright patents. Cross-reference them against the Sterling Innovations pitch deck that was submitted to our client. Build an incident report. Marcus replied less than a minute later. You found a rat. A massive one, I replied, and he is marrying my sister. Copy that, Marcus typed back. I will have the legal brief ready by morning. Do we notify the client immediately to cancel the meeting? I stared at the blinking cursor. If we canceled the meeting, Julian would just pivot to another victim. He would keep scamming, and my father would keep feeding him money. No, I typed back. Let him do the pitch. Let him walk into the boardroom and present the stolen code. Give him enough rope. Understood, Marcus replied. I shut down the terminal and walked into my kitchen to pour a glass of water. My hands were perfectly steady. 4 weeks remained until the Aspen wedding. I had initially planned to skip the ceremony entirely. I was disgusted by the theft and exhausted by the constant disrespect. I was officially done trying to earn a seat at a table where I was only valued as a meal ticket. The next morning, however, changed everything. I was sitting at my kitchen counter, reviewing a complex firewall deployment contract, when my phone buzzed violently. It was a text message from Harper. Attached was a chaotic, blurry photo. It showed Susan lying in a sterile hospital bed. Thick medical wires were taped aggressively to her chest, connecting her to a heart monitor. Her eyes were closed, and she looked incredibly pale. Beneath the photo, Harper had typed a frantic message. Mom's heart is failing. She collapsed this morning. The doctors say her blood pressure bottomed out. She is asking for you. Come to Denver General right now. Do not be a monster, Clara. Panic is a visceral, physical reaction. It overrides every logical protocol you have ever built. My chest tightened and my breathing grew shallow. Despite the extortion, despite the lies, despite the cruel insults, Susan was still my mother. I dropped the $1 million contract review onto the counter. I did not grab my jacket. I ran out the door, started my car, and drove 80 miles per hour down the highway toward the hospital. My mind raced with terrible possibilities. What if the stress of the wedding caused a massive cardiac event? What if my confrontation about the stolen software triggered a stroke? When I finally arrived at Denver General, I was breathless and terrified. I sprinted through the sliding glass doors, bypassed the main directory, and hurried straight to the cardiac observation wing Harper had referenced in her text. I found room 412. The door was wide open. The bed was completely empty. The sheets were neatly folded. The heart monitor was powered down. I stood in the doorway, confused and disoriented. A nurse walked past, carrying a clipboard. I stopped her immediately. "Excuse me," I said, trying to catch my breath. "Where is the patient from this room?" "Susan West." "Did they move her to intensive care?" The nurse looked at her chart and frowned. "Susan West? No, honey. She checked herself out against medical advice about an hour ago. She said the hospital food was terrible and she wanted real coffee." My panic evaporated instantly. It was replaced by a cold, creeping realization. I walked slowly back to the elevators and rode them down to the main floor. I scanned the bustling hospital cafeteria. There, sitting at a small corner table, was my dying mother. Susan was casually peeling off the sticky EKG sensor pads from her collarbone while sipping a large iced vanilla latte. She looked perfectly healthy. Her color was normal. She was scrolling through her tablet with absolute leisure. I walked over and stood over the table. My shadow fell across her screen. Susan looked up. She did not look guilty. She looked annoyed that I had interrupted her scrolling. "It was just acid reflux," she said dismissively, waving a manicured hand in the air. The doctors here overreact to everything. But since you are here, you have to promise to come to the wedding. With my health being so fragile, it might literally be my last." She took a long sip of her latte and did not make eye contact. It was a calculated trap, a fake health emergency designed solely to manipulate my guilt and ensure her favorite punching bag would be present for the final act in Aspen. I played along perfectly. I nodded quietly, looking incredibly defeated. "Okay, Mom," I said softly. "I promise I will be there." She smiled a tight, victorious smirk. "Good. Now go tell the barista they used the wrong syrup. I asked for sugar-free." Susan stood up and walked briskly toward the coffee counter, leaving her expensive tablet sitting completely unlocked on the table. People who fake heart conditions to manipulate their children usually leave their digital footprints unprotected, and my mother was no exception. I stood completely frozen in the middle of the Denver General Hospital cafeteria. The smell of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner suddenly felt overwhelming. My mother had just walked away to berate a teenage barista, leaving her expensive tablet sitting flat on the laminate table. The screen was brightly lit and entirely unlocked. I am a cybersecurity architect. My entire professional existence is dedicated to finding vulnerabilities and exposing malicious actors. Leaving an unsecured device within my reach is a fatal error. I did not hesitate. I reached down and tapped the glowing screen. It was an open messaging application. The active window displayed a group chat titled The A-Team. There were exactly 3 participants: Susan Thomas and Harper. I scrolled up. My hands did not tremble. The initial panic I felt during the drive to the hospital had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical detachment. I read the messages sent just 30 minutes prior while I was risking a speeding ticket to get to what I thought was a deathbed. Harper had typed the first message. "Is the gullible cash cow coming to the hospital?" Susan replied 2 minutes later, "Yes." The heart palpitation act worked perfectly. She sounded terrified on the phone. "She will definitely be at the wedding now." Thomas chimed in almost immediately. "Good. Once Julie unlocks down the Sterling Family Trust, we will not need her pathetic IT salary anymore. Make sure the slideshow completely buries her on Saturday. We need Richard and Victoria to understand that Clara is the defective one, so they do not associate her failures with our side of the family." I digested the sheer sociopathy of their words. They viewed my destruction not just as a necessary evil, but as a source of entertainment and social strategy. I continued scrolling back through the chat history, needing to see how deep the poison went. A message from 4 months ago caught my eye. It was a casual text from Thomas. "I took the antique brass urn to the pawn shop downtown today. Got $400 for it. That should cover your engagement party shoes, Harper." Susan replied with a string of laughing emojis. "Did you dump the dirt out first?" Thomas answered. "Obviously, I rinsed it out in the backyard sink. Nobody is going to miss a dead mutt from 15 years ago." My breath caught in my throat. A physical, heavy weight dropped into my stomach. The brass urn had rested on the top shelf of my childhood closet for over a decade. It held the ashes of my golden retriever, Copper. When I was a teenager navigating the emotional minefield of living with narcissists, Copper was my only refuge. He was the only creature in that house who was genuinely glad to see me. I had specifically asked my parents to keep the urn safe when I moved into my first tiny apartment. They did not just sell the urn. They washed his ashes down a utility sink to buy designer shoes. They did not view me as a human being. I was a resource to be harvested and a target to be humiliated. I pulled my personal phone from my pocket and activated the high-definition camera. I meticulously photographed every single screen of the chat history, every cruel joke, every admission of extortion, every timestamp. I opened a secure encrypted channel to Marcus. My chief operating officer was a former military intelligence analyst. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply executed objectives. I attached the photographic evidence and typed a direct order. "Marcus, I need you to moonlight as a freelance audiovisual technician for a luxury wedding in Aspen this Saturday. Clear your schedule." Marcus replied within 30 seconds. "Payload confirmed. Give me the venue details. I will ensure we have full system override capabilities." I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket just as Susan returned to the table. She was holding a new iced latte and wearing an expression of deep annoyance. "This hospital is incompetent," she complained, taking a sip. "Are you still standing here, Clara? You can leave now. Just remember to wear something appropriate this weekend. Do not embarrass us." I looked at the woman who birthed me. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, just the hollow realization that I was looking at a stranger. "I will see you in Aspen, Mom," I said quietly. I spent the next 2 days preparing my armor. During my divorce 5 years prior, my ex-husband had mocked my ambitions. He told me my tech company was a pathetic hobby that would bankrupt us. He weaponized my fertility struggles during mediation, claiming I was less of a woman because I could not give him an heir. I spent 2 years rebuilding my self-worth from the ground up. I launched Westgrid Cyber from my guest bedroom and turned it into a $45 million enterprise. I learned how to survive being underestimated. Friday evening arrived, bringing the rehearsal dinner at a high-end Aspen ski lodge. The venue featured vaulted timber ceilings, massive stone fireplaces, and waiters circulating with trays of imported caviar. I walked through the heavy oak doors wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit. The cut was aggressive and authoritative. I looked exactly like the corporate executive I was. Susan intercepted me before I could even reach the coat check. She was holding a plastic garment bag. "What are you wearing?" she hissed, dragging her eyes over my suit with deep disgust. "You cannot wear that tomorrow. You look incredibly bulky and masculine." She unzipped the plastic bag and pulled out a garish neon yellow polyester dress. It was an oversized, shapeless sack that looked like it had been salvaged from a discount thrift store. "Wear this tomorrow," she demanded, shoving the cheap fabric into my chest. "It hides your physical flaws. The color will help you blend into the background." It was a deliberate psychological tactic, a physical manifestation of my assigned role. They wanted me to look absurd in the official wedding photographs. They needed me to be the family clown so Harper could shine brighter by comparison. I took the hanger smoothly. "I will certainly take it into consideration, Mom," I replied, keeping my tone pleasantly neutral. Before Susan could launch another insult, Thomas materialized from the crowd. He grabbed my elbow with a sudden, bruising grip and yanked me forcefully into a quiet alcove near the restrooms. His face was flushed with expensive bourbon and raw anxiety. "Listen to me very carefully," he ordered, jabbing a thick finger against my shoulder. "Julian's parents are circulating in the main dining room. They are old money. They are elite. You are going to sit in the back tonight and keep your mouth shut." I looked past his shoulder, observing the crowded room. "Do not speak to them," Thomas continued, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "If they somehow corner you and ask what you do for a living, you will tell them you do basic data entry. You will not mention your failed marriage. You will not mention your medical issues. You will absolutely not embarrass this family with your depressing life story." I shifted my gaze toward the center of the lodge. I located the groom's parents holding court by the fireplace. Victoria Sterling was draped in authentic diamonds, looking profoundly bored with the local guests. Standing next to her was her husband. He was an imposing figure, holding a crystal glass of scotch. He wore a custom-tailored navy blazer and carried himself with the effortless gravity of a man who controls industries. Thomas followed my line of sight and scoffed. "That is Richard Sterling," he whispered reverently. "He is a billionaire venture capitalist. He is the man who is going to make your sister rich. Do not even breathe in his direction, Clara." I looked back at my father. My expression remained perfectly composed, but internally I was smiling with razor-sharp anticipation. Thomas had absolutely no idea who he was talking about. He had no idea that the billionaire venture capitalist standing 30 feet away was not just an elite stranger. Richard Sterling sat securely on the corporate advisory board of WestGrid Cyber. Just 3 days ago, I had personally finalized the encrypted security matrix protecting his offshore financial portfolios. Richard trusted me with his entire digital life. "I understand perfectly, Dad," I stated, smoothing the lapel of my charcoal suit. "I will not say a single word to him." I stepped out of the alcove, leaving Thomas to sweat in his own insecurity. The chessboard was now fully set, and the wealthiest pawns were completely unaware of the game. I retired to my hotel suite early, needing to run final diagnostics with Marcus. But the tranquility would not last long. My parents had one final, desperate shakedown planned before the ceremony, and it was going to require an aggressive confrontation the very next morning. Saturday morning arrived with a biting mountain chill. I sat at the mahogany desk in my hotel suite, watching the morning light reflect off the fresh snow outside my window. I was drinking black tea and reviewing a secure data packet Marcus had compiled overnight. The resort was completely silent at 6 in the morning, but I knew the tranquility was an illusion. The predators were just waking up. At exactly 8 o'clock, the silence shattered. My heavy hotel door violently swung open. Harper burst into my suite wearing a white silk bridal robe. Her face was flushed and her breathing was ragged. She was performing absolute hysteria. Susan and Thomas marched into the room directly behind her. They moved like a tactical unit deploying into hostile territory. The heavy scent of aerosol hairspray and expensive floral perfume immediately suffocated the small space. "The florist canceled," Harper shrieked, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my face. "The wire transfer bounced and they are refusing to deliver the centerpieces. You completely ruined my wedding." I set my teacup down on the wooden desk. The ceramic clinked softly against the saucer. I did not stand up. I simply observed the theatrical display unfolding in front of my bed. Thomas stepped forward. His face was twisted into a mask of practiced, righteous anger. He planted his feet firmly on the carpet and crossed his arms, trying to physically intimidate me with his presence. "You were supposed to double-check the venue finances, Clara," he barked. His voice was loud enough to echo down the hallway. "I told you to ensure the vendor accounts were secure. This is entirely your fault for being careless." It was a breathtaking display of gaslighting. I had never agreed to manage their vendors. I had never been given access to the floral accounts. Thomas was entirely fabricating a responsibility out of thin air to justify the shakedown. "Give me your credit card right now," Thomas demanded, holding out his open palm. "We need $15,000 to secure a replacement florist from Denver on short notice. We have to pay rush delivery fees. Hand over the card." I looked at his outstretched hand. I looked at Susan, who was nodding in agreement while inspecting her nails. Then I looked at Harper. Her fake tears had magically stopped falling the second Thomas demanded the money. She was watching me with hungry, expectant eyes. They were so confident in their manipulation. They genuinely believed I was the same broken girl who used to hand over her allowance just to buy a scrap of their approval. "I am not giving you my credit card," I stated. My voice was perfectly flat, carrying zero emotional weight. The refusal hit the room like a physical blow. Thomas dropped his hand. Susan stopped looking at her nails. Harper let out a loud, dramatic gasp. "You are going to ruin my perfect day over money?" Harper screamed, stepping closer to my desk. "You make a pathetic salary anyway. Just put it on a credit card and pay it off later. Stop being so incredibly selfish." "I am not paying $15,000 for your flowers, Harper," I repeated, maintaining steady eye contact. "Deal with it yourself." The bridal mask slipped completely. Harper's face contorted into genuine, venomous rage. The entitlement she felt over my resources was absolute, and being denied access to my wallet triggered a vicious reaction. "This is exactly why your husband left you," Harper spat. Her voice echoed off the walls, vibrating with malice. "You are completely barren. You are bitter, and you are entirely useless to everyone around you. You cannot even be a real woman, so you just try to drag everyone else down into your miserable, lonely life." She grabbed a heavy velvet decorative pillow from the hotel armchair and hurled it directly at my head. I easily tilted my neck, letting the velvet cushion sail past me and hit the wall with a dull thud. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I calmly stood up, picked up my leather handbag, and walked straight toward the door. Susan stepped into my path, trying to block the exit. "You are a disgrace to this family," Susan hissed. "Excuse me," I said, stepping smoothly around her frozen posture. "I have a wedding to attend." I walked out of the suite and let the heavy door click shut behind me. As I walked down the carpeted hallway, I pulled my phone from my bag. I opened the encrypted file Marcus had sent me earlier that morning. I already knew the florist had not canceled. I had instructed Marcus to run a forensic trace on the specific floral wire transfer Thomas mentioned. The funds had never bounced. They had never even been sent to a florist. Harper had successfully routed the initial $15,000 from Thomas directly into a private offshore banking application. I found the corresponding digital receipt for her actual purchase. She did not buy hydrangeas or roses. She had purchased a custom haute couture designer dress to wear at her exclusive late-night after-party. The entire morning confrontation was a fabricated crisis, a coordinated financial hit designed to extract a final lump sum of cash from the family scapegoat before the ceremony officially began. The sheer, unadulterated greed was staggering. 4 hours later, the ceremony commenced. The setting was breathtakingly beautiful, a massive glass pavilion constructed on a pristine ridge overlooking the snow-capped Rocky Mountains. Sunlight filtered through the transparent ceiling, illuminating the rows of white wooden chairs and the aisles lined with expensive imported greenery. As instructed by Thomas during the rehearsal dinner, I was placed in the most humiliating seat available. I was assigned to the very last row in the far back corner. My chair was positioned directly behind a massive structural stone pillar. My view of the altar was completely obstructed. I could not see the officiant. I could not see the floral arches. I was physically isolated from the rest of the guests, hidden away like a shameful secret. It was a deliberate, petty microaggression, a physical reminder of my hierarchical standing within their social structure. The orchestral music swelled, the guests stood. I remained seated behind my stone column, listening to the rustle of silk and the soft murmurs of the elite attendees. The ceremony proceeded with practiced elegance until it was time for the couple to exchange their personal vows. Harper took the microphone. Her voice carried clearly through the sophisticated sound system. She sounded pure and saccharine, dripping with manufactured emotion. But I knew her vocabulary well enough to recognize the poisoned darts hidden between the romantic platitudes. Julianne, she projected, letting her delicate voice echo through the glass structure. You showed me what true loyalty really means. You stayed by my side through everything. Unlike some people in this family who give up on love, fail at their marriages, and abandon their relatives when things get slightly difficult, you are a real man. A collective, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the back rows. Several guests shifted awkwardly in their seats, twisting their necks to glance at my hidden corner behind the pillar. They knew exactly who the bride was talking about. It was a weaponized public insult disguised as a romantic declaration. I leaned slightly to my left, using the reflective glass wall of the pavilion as a mirror, to observe the altar. I could see Julian standing there. He was grinning. A smug, victorious smirk spread across his face as he looked out toward the crowd. He was thoroughly enjoying my public degradation. But my attention quickly shifted to the front row. Through the glass reflection, I focused entirely on Victoria Sterling. The billionaire matriarch was sitting perfectly upright in her tailored designer suit. Victoria did not look touched by the vows. She did not wipe away a happy tear. Her posture was completely rigid. Her jaw was tightly clenched, and her eyes were narrowed. She looked intensely uncomfortable with the hostility radiating from the bride. Old money despises public vulgarity, and Harper was broadcasting her petty family drama on a megaphone. I felt my phone vibrate silently in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the illuminated screen. It was a direct message from Marcus. Payload successfully delivered to the main audiovisual system. I have full administrative control over the reception hall network. awaiting your final command. I locked the screen and let the phone drop back into my pocket. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife. The crowd erupted into polite applause. The wedding was officially sealed. That meant the financial trap my parents had so carefully constructed for the Sterling family was now fully locked into place. The marriage certificate was signed, the legal and social bonds were forged. Thomas and Susan genuinely believed they had won. They thought they had secured their eternal access to the Sterling Trust Fund and successfully buried their scapegoat daughter in the process. They had absolutely no idea that they were walking straight into a digital slaughterhouse. I sat quietly behind my stone pillar, listening to the triumphant exit music, and prepared myself for the reception. The appetizers were about to be served, but the main course was going to be total destruction. The guests transitioned from the glass pavilion into the grand Alpine ballroom for the reception. The sheer concentration of wealth in one single room was staggering. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting warm golden light over massive round tables draped in heavy ivory linen. Towering centerpieces constructed of white orchids and silver branches dominated the space. Waiters wearing crisp black uniforms circulated effortlessly, carrying silver trays loaded with seared scallops and vintage champagne. It was a masterpiece of high society performance. I navigated through the dense sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, searching for my assigned seat. I found it at table 18. It was located in the absolute darkest corner of the massive ballroom. My chair was positioned mere inches away from the heavy wooden swinging doors of the catering kitchen. Every time a waiter rushed through those doors, a sudden blast of hot, humid air, carrying the heavy scent of roasted meat and industrial dishwashers, washed over my back. The isolation was entirely intentional. Susan and Thomas had strategically placed me as far away from the Sterling family as architecturally possible. They needed me present to fulfill their twisted family narrative, but they needed me invisible so I could not speak up and contradict their complex web of lies. I sat down at the empty table. The other assigned guests had apparently abandoned their seats to mingle near the open bar, leaving me entirely alone in the shadows. I smoothed the fabric of my charcoal suit and reached into my pocket. I pulled out my phone. The bright screen illuminated my face in the dim corner. I needed a strong anchor. I needed to remind myself exactly why I was sitting next to a hot kitchen prepared to digitally dismantle my own blood relatives. I opened a highly encrypted application on my device. 4 weeks ago in the Denver General Hospital cafeteria, I had not just taken simple photographs of my mother's unlocked tablet. I am a cybersecurity expert. Leaving an unsecured device near me is always a fatal error. During those brief 2 minutes while Susan complained to a terrified barista about her coffee syrup, I had executed a rapid wireless bridge. I cloned the device's messaging token. For the past month, I had possessed a silent, invisible mirror peering directly into their private communications. I had been reading the group chat titled The A-Team in real time. I scrolled back through the archived logs to the exact day of the fake hospital emergency. Reading the words again sent a renewed wave of absolute freezing clarity through my veins. Harper had typed, "Is the cash cow coming to the hospital?" Susan had replied, "Yes." The heart palpitation act worked perfectly. She will definitely be at the wedding. Thomas had followed up with, "Good. Once Julian locks down the Sterling Family Trust, we will not need her pathetic IT salary anymore. Make sure the slideshow completely buries her." I stared at the glowing text. They had mapped out my psychological destruction with the casual efficiency of planning a weekend grocery list. They were heavily relying on the slideshow to publicly brand me as a failure, ensuring the powerful Sterling family viewed me as a defective outcast, disconnected from their flawless lineage. But the message that truly eradicated any lingering shred of familial obligation was buried slightly further up the thread. A casual text from Thomas sent months earlier. "I took the antique brass urn to the pawn shop downtown today, got $400 for it. That should cover your engagement party shoes, Harper. Susan had responded, "Did you dump the dirt out first?" Thomas had answered, "Obviously. I rinsed it out in the backyard sink. Nobody is going to miss a dead mutt from 15 years ago." My chest tightened instantly as a phantom, physical ache radiated through my ribs. That urn had held the ashes of Copper, my childhood golden retriever. During my teenage years, when the narcissistic abuse in that house became utterly suffocating, Copper was my only true sanctuary. He used to sleep on the hard floor next to my bed, offering the only unconditional warmth I was ever permitted to experience. When I moved into my first tiny apartment, I begged my parents to keep the urn safe on the top shelf of my old closet because I did not want it getting damaged during the difficult transition. They did not just pawn the brass vessel, they callously poured my only source of childhood comfort down a utility drain so Harper could purchase designer heels for a cocktail party. My blood went absolute ice. The sheer sociopathy required to execute that action and then casually joke about it in a group chat was completely unfathomable. They were not just using my bank account to fund their lifestyle. They actively enjoyed destroying my spirit. They thrived on inflicting deep emotional pain. A soft chime pulled me out of the digital archives. A new message had just populated the live chat thread. I looked across the massive ballroom. At the elevated head table, Susan was smiling brightly at a distant relative, while her hands rested elegantly in her silk lap. But underneath the heavy ivory tablecloth, her thumbs were moving rapidly across her hidden phone screen. The text message appeared instantly on my cloned interface. Susan had written, "She is isolated at table 18. Richard Sterling is completely ignoring her. The plan is holding." Harper was sitting 2 chairs down from Susan. She reached for her champagne flute with her right hand while tapping her phone screen with her left. Harper replied, "Perfect. The AV guy just confirmed the slideshow is queued up for the toasts. I cannot wait to see her face when the entire room sees what a pathetic loser she really is." I lowered my device and watched them playing their dual roles. To the 200 elite guests in the ballroom, they were the beautiful picture of refined grace and loving family unity. In the digital shadows, they were venomous predators circling their trapped prey. They thought they were in total control of the narrative. They genuinely believed the audiovisual technician running the complex projector system was just a random local contractor hired by the Aspen Resort. They had absolutely no idea who was actually sitting inside the darkened control booth overlooking the grand ballroom. I opened my direct communication channel to Marcus. My chief operating officer and lead security architect was currently wearing a black venue polo shirt, blending in perfectly with the catering staff. 4 weeks ago, while standing in the sterile hospital cafeteria, absorbing the massive betrayal of my mother's fake heart attack, I had sent him a very specific request. "Marcus," I had texted, "I need you to moonlight as a freelance AV technician for a wedding in Aspen." He had infiltrated the local vendor network, intercepted the staffing schedule, and seamlessly inserted himself as the primary system operator for the evening. Every single microphone, every audio speaker, and every high-definition screen in the building was now flowing through a routing server that Marcus directly controlled. I typed a new message to him, keeping my phone shielded below the table edge. "Status report." Marcus replied instantly. The targets provided a USB drive containing their presentation. I have successfully isolated their original file and quarantined it within a hidden partition. The payload you provided is fully loaded and holding in the primary launch queue. I have locked the physical heavy doors to the control booth. Nobody can access the hardware but me. I looked up toward the tinted glass windows of the elevated tech booth. I could not see Marcus, but I knew he was up there, monitoring the entire room like a trained hawk. "Excellent," I replied. "Maintain radio silence until you receive my final execution signal." I set the phone face down on the table next to my untouched dinner plate. The string quartet in the corner of the room began playing a lively classical piece, signaling the transition from the cocktail hour into the formal reception events. The trap was meticulously set. The bait was in place, The predators were eagerly preparing to strike. But people who fake medical emergencies and leave their digital footprints unprotected always make one final, fatal miscalculation. They assume their target is completely unarmed. The maid of honor approached the center stage and tapped the microphone. The high-pitched audio feedback echoed loudly through the crystal chandeliers, calling the wealthy crowd to attention. It was finally time for the special presentation. The maid of honor tapped the heavy microphone stand, and a sharp ringing sound pierced the elegant atmosphere of the Grand Alpine Ballroom. She nervously shuffled her thick stack of index cards, preparing to introduce the digital presentation. In that brief window of anticipation, my mind drifted away from the immediate chaos and returned to the events of the previous evening. Friday night had officially set the stage for this exact moment. The rehearsal dinner was the true catalyst for my current wardrobe and my forced isolation at Table 18. The Friday event had been hosted at an extremely exclusive, high-end Aspen ski lodge located halfway up the mountain. The venue was a fortress of dark mahogany beams and massive riverstone fireplaces. The air inside smelled heavily of burning cedar and imported cigars. Waiters drifted silently across the plush carpets, offering trays of elk carpaccio and aged scotch. I had walked through the heavy wooden front doors, feeling entirely armored. I was wearing a meticulously tailored charcoal gray suit constructed from fine Italian wool. The sharp lines of the jacket and the structured shoulders made me feel powerful and untouchable. I looked like a woman who ran a multi-million-dollar company, because that is exactly what I was. My protective armor was immediately challenged. I had barely handed my cashmere overcoat to the attendant when Susan intercepted me near the coat check. She stepped into my path with a look of profound horror contorting her features. In her hands, she carried a plastic garment bag. She unzipped it aggressively and pulled out a garment that assaulted the eyes. It was a garish, neon yellow, oversized polyester dress. The fabric was stiff and unnaturally shiny, reflecting the lodge lighting in a way that looked incredibly cheap. It resembled a shapeless tent salvaged from a discount bin. "You cannot possibly wear that suit tomorrow, Clara," she hissed loudly enough for a passing waiter to pause and glance in our direction. Her eyes raked up and down my tailored clothing with open disgust. "You look far too bulky and incredibly masculine. You need to wear this instead." She shoved the neon yellow fabric toward my chest. The cheap synthetic material scratched against my wool lapel. "Wear this," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "It hides your physical flaws. The bright color will make you look softer and less intimidating. You always try to look so harsh, and it makes people uncomfortable." It was a masterful deployment of psychological cruelty, a calculated pebble of pure vanity meant to erode my self-esteem. She did not want me looking soft. She wanted me looking absolutely ridiculous. She wanted me draped in a clownish polyester sack so that when I stood next to the radiant bride, the visual contrast would be devastating. It was a physical manifestation of my designated role in the family hierarchy, the ugly, uncomfortable outcast. Before I could verbally decline her offensive offering, a heavy hand clamped down on my right arm. Thomas materialized from the crowd. His thick fingers dug deeply into the fabric of my jacket sleeve, gripping my elbow with a bruising intensity. He did not say hello. He forcefully yanked me away from Susan and dragged me toward a dimly lit alcove near the wine cellar. His face was flushed, and his breathing smelled heavily of strong whiskey. "Listen to me very closely," he growled, leaning in so close I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "Julian has parents here tonight. They are old money, Clara, generational wealth. They demand respect and perfection." He released my arm, giving me a slight shove backward into the shadows of the alcove. "You are going to sit in the back corner tomorrow. You will not approach them. You will not initiate conversation with them under any circumstances. If they somehow stumble into you and ask what you do for a living, you will tell them you do basic data entry for a local software company." I stood perfectly still, letting his condescension wash over me like radio static. "Do you understand me?" Thomas demanded, his voice trembling with anxious authority. "Do not mention your failed marriage. Do not talk about your barren medical issues. Do not bring up your inability to hold on to a man. You will keep your mouth shut, and you will not embarrass us in front of these people." He was trying to shrink me. He was desperately attempting to fold me into a tiny, invisible box so his own fabricated empire could look larger by comparison. I slowly turned my head and looked past his aggressive posture. Through the arched entryway of the dining room, I could clearly see the groom and his family. Richard and Victoria Sterling were holding court near the largest roaring fireplace. Victoria was draped in authentic diamonds that caught the firelight with every subtle movement. She looked regal and entirely unimpressed by the local attendees fawning over her. Beside her stood Richard Sterling. He was an imposing figure holding a crystal glass of expensive bourbon. He wore a custom navy blazer and possessed the effortless, commanding gravity of a man who controlled global industries. Other guests orbited around him, desperately hoping to catch a fraction of his lucrative attention. Thomas followed my gaze and let out a nervous, derisive scoff. "That is Richard Sterling," my father whispered reverently. "He is a billionaire venture capitalist. He holds the key to your sister's entire future, so do not even breathe in his direction. You are absolutely nothing compared to him." I turned my attention back to Thomas. My facial expression remained a mask of total neutrality. I did not betray a single ounce of the electric anticipation coursing through my veins. "I understand, Dad," I replied, my voice completely smooth and detached. "I will stay far away from him." Thomas gave me one final, disgusted glare before turning on his heel and marching back toward the bar to fetch another drink. I remained in the alcove, observing the room. The sheer magnitude of my father's ignorance was almost beautiful. He believed he was manipulating a chessboard while completely blind to the actual pieces in play. Thomas had absolutely no idea that Richard Sterling was not just some distant billionaire investor. He had no idea that Richard sat directly on the executive advisory board of Westgrid Cyber. He did not know that Richard trusted my company explicitly. Just 3 weeks prior, I had personally sat in a highly secured boardroom with Richard, going over the encrypted architecture protecting his offshore financial portfolios. I was the lead architect, safeguarding his entire generational wealth from malicious corporate espionage. Richard Sterling knew my name. He knew my capabilities. He knew my worth. And he certainly knew I did not do basic data entry. That Friday night interaction was the exact reason I had proudly worn my tailored charcoal suit to the ceremony today, instead of the neon yellow trash bag. It was the reason I accepted my isolated placement at table 18 without a single complaint. I did not need to fight for a seat at their table, because I already owned the room. The sharp tap of the microphone brought me violently back to the present moment inside the Grand Alpine Ballroom. The flashback dissolved as the maid of honor finally cleared her throat. The polite chatter among the 200 elite guests faded into an expectant hush. The digital presentation was officially beginning. The trap my parents had spent months constructing was finally springing shut. But they were entirely unaware that the very man they were trying to impress with my humiliation was about to become their ultimate executioner. The billionaire sitting at the head table was paying very close attention to the screen, and the countdown to absolute destruction had just hit 0. The ballroom plunged into total darkness as the maid of honor tapped her microphone. In those agonizing seconds of heavy silence before the massive projector booted up, my mind snapped backward. The rehearsal dinner humiliation had merely been the appetizer in their banquet of cruelty. The main course of their manipulation occurred exactly 4 hours before the ceremony officially began. As I sat in the dark, waiting for my warped face to flash across the 15-foot screen, I replayed the desperate final shakedown they had attempted that very morning. Saturday had started with a deceptive calmness. I was sitting inside my luxury hotel suite at 8 o'clock in the morning, Crisp mountain sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I had ordered a pot of black tea from room service and set up my encrypted workstation on the heavy mahogany desk. The environment was serene and perfectly ordered. I was reviewing advanced security protocols for a massive corporate client, letting the familiar logic of firewalls and routing tables soothe my nerves. My digital world was a fortress of absolute certainty, which stood in stark contrast to the chaotic, emotional minefield of my family. That fragile peace shattered violently at 8:15. The heavy wooden door to my suite did not just open. It was forcefully shoved inward, slamming against the brass wall stopper with a deafening crack. Harper burst into my room like a localized hurricane. She was wearing a white silk bridal robe embroidered with the word "wifey" across the back in glittering silver thread. Her hair was partially pinned up in hot rollers, and her face was flushed a deep, unnatural red. She was performing a state of absolute hysteria, gasping for air and clutching her chest. Behind her marched Susan and Thomas. They flanked the bride like tactical enforcers entering a hostile combat zone. The small suite was instantly suffocated by the overpowering scent of aerosol hairspray mixed with expensive floral perfume and raw panic. "The florist canceled," Harper shrieked, pointing a perfectly manicured, trembling finger directly at my face. "The wire transfer bounced this morning, and they are refusing to deliver the centerpieces or the bridal bouquet. You completely ruined my wedding." I stopped typing. I gently closed the lid of my laptop and picked up my porcelain teacup. I did not stand up or match her frantic energy. I simply observed the theatrical display unfolding at the foot of my bed. Thomas stepped forward, closing the physical distance between us. His face was twisted into a mask of practiced, righteous anger. Veins bulged along his thick neck as he planted his feet firmly on the carpet, crossing his arms to maximize his intimidating physical presence. "You were supposed to double-check the venue finances, Clara," he barked, his voice vibrating with manufactured fury. "I specifically told you to ensure the vendor accounts were secure. This massive disaster is entirely your fault for being careless and selfish." It was a breathtaking display of psychological gaslighting. I had never once agreed to manage their wedding vendors. I had never been granted administrative access to the floral accounts or the venue ledgers. Thomas was entirely fabricating a responsibility out of thin air to justify his impending attack. He was rewriting history in real time, banking on my historical habit of accepting blame just to keep the peace. "Give me your premium credit card right now," Thomas demanded, holding out his open palm toward my desk. "We need $15,000 to secure a replacement premium florist from downtown Denver on incredibly short notice. We have to pay outrageous rush delivery fees and emergency labor costs. Hand over the card, Clara. We do not have time to argue." I looked at his outstretched hand. I looked at Susan, who was aggressively nodding in agreement while casually inspecting a chipped fingernail. Then I shifted my gaze to Harper. Her dramatic fake tears had magically stopped falling the very second Thomas demanded the financial transaction. She was watching me with hungry, expectant eyes, waiting for the familiar submission she had grown up witnessing. They were so incredibly confident in their manipulation. They genuinely believed I was the exact same broken girl who used to empty her meager savings account to buy a scrap of their conditional approval. They thought the pressure of the impending ceremony would force me to fold. "I am not giving you my credit card," I stated. My voice was perfectly flat, carrying zero emotional weight or hesitation. The blunt refusal hit the room like a physical shockwave. Thomas dropped his hand slowly, his jaw going slack. Susan stopped looking at her nails and snapped her head upright. Harper let out a loud, exaggerated gasp of pure disbelief. "You are going to ruin my perfect day over money," Harper screamed, taking a menacing step toward my workstation. "You make a pathetic entry-level salary anyway. Just put the emergency charge on a credit card and pay it off over the next 5 years. Stop being so incredibly selfish for one single day in your miserable life. I am not paying $15,000 for your emergency flowers, Harper," I repeated, maintaining steady, unbroken eye contact. "You are an adult. Deal with your own vendor crisis. The delicate bridal mask dissolved completely. Harper's face contorted into genuine, venomous rage. The absolute entitlement she felt over my personal resources was staggering, and being firmly denied access to my wallet triggered a vicious, uncontrollable reaction. "This is exactly why your husband left you," Harper spat. Her voice echoed harshly off the hotel walls, vibrating with pure malice. "You are completely barren. You are bitter, and you are entirely useless to everyone around you. You cannot even function as a real woman, so you just try to drag everyone else down into your pathetic, lonely existence." The words were designed to be lethal. She had reached into the darkest, most painful chapter of my past and weaponized my medical trauma. 5 years ago, that specific insult would have brought me to my knees. It would have sent me spiraling into a deep depression. But sitting at that desk, I realized those words held absolutely no power over me anymore. I had spent years meticulously rebuilding my self-worth brick by brick. Her cruelty did not expose my weakness. It only highlighted her profound moral bankruptcy. When her verbal assault failed to produce the desired tears, Harper resorted to physical violence. She reached out and grabbed a heavy, decorative velvet pillow from the armchair beside my desk. With a feral grunt, she hurled the heavy cushion directly at my head. I calmly tilted my torso to the left. The embroidered velvet projectile sailed harmlessly past my shoulder and struck the hotel wall lamp with a dull, pathetic thud. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or offer a single defensive argument. I stood up smoothly, unplugged my encrypted laptop, and placed it securely inside my leather briefcase. I slung the strap over my shoulder and walked straight toward the heavy wooden door. Susan stepped nervously into my path, attempting to block the exit with her body. "You are a disgusting disgrace to this family," she hissed, her eyes narrowing into hateful slits. "Excuse me," I said, stepping seamlessly around her frozen posture. "I have a wedding ceremony to attend." I walked out of the luxury suite and let the heavy door click firmly shut behind me, severing their frantic shouting. As I strode down the quiet, carpeted hallway, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my mobile device. I opened the secure communication application and accessed the forensic data packet Marcus had transmitted earlier that morning. I already knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that the florist had never canceled. Before Thomas even knocked on my door, I had instructed Marcus to run a deep digital trace on the specific floral wire transfer my father mentioned during a previous conversation. The financial funds had never bounced. The money had never even been directed toward a legitimate botanical vendor in Colorado. Harper had successfully routed the initial $15,000 from her father's account through a series of complex digital tumblers. Marcus had effortlessly unraveled the transactional maze. The funds had been deposited directly into her own private offshore banking application. I scrolled down to the final page of the encrypted report. Marcus had located the corresponding digital receipt for her actual purchase. She did not buy hydrangeas, peonies, or imported roses. Harper had selfishly purchased a custom haute couture designer dress shipped directly from a boutique in Paris to wear exclusively at her late-night after-party. The entire morning confrontation had been a completely fabricated crisis. It was a highly coordinated financial hit designed to extract a massive final lump sum of cash from the family scapegoat before the legal ceremony bound her to the Sterling Empire. The sheer, unadulterated greed was absolutely breathtaking. That realization anchored me. It solidified my resolve. As I sat in the darkness of the Grand Alpine Ballroom watching the massive projector screen flicker to life, I knew I was not destroying a loving family. I was dismantling a criminal syndicate masquerading as high society royalty. The projector beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the 15-foot screen. The trap was finally springing shut, but my finger was already hovering over the execution command. 4 hours after I walked out of that toxic hotel suite, the official wedding ceremony commenced. The setting was undeniably spectacular. A breathtaking glass pavilion had been constructed specifically for the event, perched on a pristine rocky ridge overlooking the snow-capped Aspen Mountains. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the transparent ceiling panels, casting a warm, ethereal glow over the immaculate rows of white wooden chairs. The interior smelled heavily of imported eucalyptus and fresh white roses, which was a deeply ironic detail, considering my sister had screamed about a canceled florist mere hours ago. I arrived at the venue wearing my tailored charcoal suit. I handed my embossed invitation card to a young usher wearing a crisp tuxedo. He scanned the calligraphy on the heavy cardstock and offered a tight, polite smile before leading me down the central aisle. We walked past rows of elite guests, adorned in designer winter couture and rare furs. We passed the front section, reserved for the Sterling family, where the true generational wealth resided. We continued walking toward the rear of the structure, moving further away from the altar and the floral arches. The usher finally stopped at the absolute last row. He gestured toward a single chair positioned directly behind a massive structural stone pillar. It was a thick architectural column supporting the vaulted glass ceiling. I sat down and immediately realized my view of the altar was completely obstructed. I could not see the officiant. I could not see the groom. I could only stare at a wall of gray granite. It was a deliberate and petty placement. My parents had designed the seating chart to ensure the family scapegoat remained entirely out of sight during the professional photographs and video recordings. They wanted to project an image of flawless lineage, and I was the blemish they needed to hide. I settled into the uncomfortable wooden chair and let my mind wander while the string quartet tuned their instruments. I thought about my ex-husband and the divorce that my family found so deeply offensive. They never cared about the emotional devastation of my failed marriage. They only cared about the lost social capital. My former spouse had been a prominent corporate lawyer. When our relationship dissolved because of his relentless cruelty regarding my fertility struggles, Thomas and Susan did not offer comfort. They treated my medical trauma as a strategic failure. They viewed marriage as a lucrative financial merger, and by walking away from a wealthy man, I had fundamentally failed their primary objective. That history was the exact ammunition Harper planned to weaponize today. The classical music swelled, filling the remarkable acoustics of the glass pavilion. The attendees rose to their feet. I remained seated behind my stone barrier, listening to the rustle of expensive silk as the bride made her grand entrance. The collective murmur of the crowd indicated she looked stunning. I did not need to see her to know she was radiating manufactured perfection. The ceremony proceeded with agonizing slowness. The officiant delivered a generic speech about the enduring power of devotion and the sanctity of eternal partnership. Then the atmosphere shifted. It was time for the couple to exchange their personal vows. Harper took the microphone. The audio system amplified her voice, sending it echoing clearly across the pavilion. She sounded pure and saccharine, dripping with an artificial sweetness that coated the room like thick syrup. But I knew the rhythm of her speech patterns well enough to recognize the incoming attack. She was preparing to launch poisoned darts hidden beneath a layer of romantic platitudes. Julian, she projected her delicate voice, trembling with practiced emotion. You showed me what true loyalty genuinely means. You stayed firmly by my side through every single obstacle we faced. You proved that real commitment requires strength and unyielding dedication. She paused, letting the silence stretch for maximum theatrical impact. Unlike some people in this family, she continued, her tone sharpening into a calculated blade. Unlike those who easily give up on love, fail at their marriages, and abandon their own relatives when things get slightly difficult. You are a real man, Julian. You never walk away. A collective, uncomfortable wave rippled through the back rows of the pavilion. The wealthy attendees shifted awkwardly in their seats. Several people physically twisted their necks, straining to look past the stone pillar to catch a glimpse of my reaction. They knew exactly who the bride was talking about. It was a targeted public insult, thinly disguised as a heartfelt romantic declaration. Harper was using her sacred moment at the altar to broadcast my deepest personal traumas to a room full of strangers. I leaned my torso slightly to the left, using the reflective glass wall of the pavilion as a makeshift mirror to observe the front of the room. Through the glare of the sunlight, I could clearly see Julian standing at the altar. He was grinning. A smug, victorious smirk spread across his perfectly shaved jawline as he looked out toward the crowd. He was thoroughly enjoying my public degradation, relishing the fact that his new wife was publicly asserting their dominance over the family outcast. But my attention quickly shifted away from the groom. Through the transparent reflection, I focused entirely on the front row, where the groom's parents were seated. I locked my eyes on Victoria Sterling. The billionaire matriarch was sitting perfectly upright in her tailored designer coat. Victoria did not look touched by the emotional vows. She did not reach for a tissue to wipe away a happy tear. Her posture was completely rigid. Her jaw was tightly clenched, and her eyes were narrowed into a fierce glare. She looked intensely uncomfortable with the hostility radiating from the bride. Old money despises public vulgarity. The ultra-wealthy operate on a strict code of discretion and polite restraint. They hide their scandals behind closed doors and NDAs. Harper, broadcasting her petty, vindictive family drama on a microphone, was the height of low-class behavior. Victoria Sterling was watching her future daughter-in-law expose a deeply trashy foundation, and the matriarch was visibly repulsed. I felt a short, sharp vibration in my tailored jacket pocket. I pulled out my mobile device and shielded the screen with my palm to block the sunlight. It was a direct, encrypted text message from Marcus. Payload successfully delivered to the main audiovisual system. I have full administrative control over the reception hall network. The original slideshow file is quarantined, awaiting your command. I read the words twice, letting the absolute certainty of the digital trap calm my racing pulse. The cruelty of the vows no longer mattered. The smugness on Julian's face was completely irrelevant. They were celebrating a victory on a ship that was already sinking. I locked my screen and let the device drop back into my pocket just as the officiant spoke the final binding words. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. The crowd erupted into polite applause. The string quartet immediately launched into a triumphant, joyful exit melody. The wedding was officially sealed. The marriage certificate would be signed within the hour, binding the two families together under the law. That meant the complex financial trap my parents had so carefully constructed for the Sterling family was now fully locked into place. Thomas and Susan genuinely believed they had won the ultimate prize. They thought they had secured their eternal access to the massive Sterling Trust Fund and successfully buried their scapegoat daughter in the process. They were entirely convinced their fraudulent empire was untouchable. The transition from the freezing mountain air into the grand alpine ballroom was meant to completely overwhelm the senses. The reception was an absolute masterclass in Aspen opulence. Crystal chandeliers the size of small vehicles hung from vaulted timber ceilings, casting a warm, golden glow over the immaculate space. Massive ice sculptures carved into the shapes of soaring falcons anchored the corners of the room, slowly dripping condensation onto silver trays. Waiters glided silently across the plush carpeting, balancing platters of caviar blinis and endless flutes of vintage champagne. It was a dizzying display of newly acquired wealth, designed specifically to impress the old money sitting at the front of the room. I navigated through the dense crowd of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos, locating my designated spot. I was assigned to table 18. This was not just the back of the room. It was the absolute furthest point from the bridal dais, positioned strategically next to the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. Every few seconds, a server would burst through those heavy panels, releasing a sudden gust of humid air that smelled aggressively of roasted lamb and industrial dish soap. I could feel the radiant heat of the commercial ovens pressing against my shoulder blades. My placement was a physical manifestation of my family hierarchy. They needed me inside the building to maintain the illusion of complete attendance, but they required me to remain entirely invisible. I sat down on my uncomfortable wooden chair, resting my hands flat on my lap. I did not feel humiliated by the location. I felt a profound sense of calm because I knew the architecture of the trap I was currently sitting inside. I shifted my gaze across the massive ballroom, focusing my attention on the elevated head table. The contrast in body language up there was fascinating to observe. Susan and Thomas were practically vibrating with unearned triumph. They were aggressively mingling, with the air around them clinking glasses and projecting loud, fake laughter. Julian and Harper sat together in the center, basking in the manufactured adoration of their guests. But the Sterling parents presented a completely different picture. Victoria Sterling sat rigidly with her hands folded tightly over her silk clutch, radiating aristocratic displeasure. Beside her sat Richard Sterling. The billionaire venture capitalist looked profoundly bored. He was a man who built his empire on ruthless efficiency and logical data streams. He despised frivolous social pageantry, and his current posture broadcasted a deep desire to be anywhere else on the planet. Richard began scanning the crowded ballroom. He was an apex predator, observing a room full of brightly colored birds. He casually evaluated the local Denver socialites, the minor politicians, and the desperate business owners trying to catch his eye. His gaze swept smoothly over the middle tables and continued toward the dark perimeter. Then his sharp eyes landed squarely on my dark corner. I remained perfectly still, letting him process the visual information. I watched the cognitive dissonance hit him in real time. He blinked twice. His posture immediately straightened, abandoning his previous slump. The boredom vanished from his features, replaced by absolute shock. He was trying to comprehend why the founder and chief executive officer of WestGrid Cyber, the very woman who single-handedly secured his $100 million offshore financial portfolio last Tuesday, was currently shoved next to a dishwashing station at a local wedding. Richard commanded rooms wherever he traveled. He operated on a strict code of professional respect. Recognizing an elite colleague, he immediately unbuttoned his suit jacket and began to push his chair backward, preparing to stand up and walk across the massive ballroom to greet me properly. Thomas spotted the movement instantly. My father operated on pure panicked instinct. Seeing his billionaire golden goose attempting to interact with his hidden scapegoat triggered a desperate reaction. Thomas lunged sideways, abandoning his champagne flute to intercept the older man. He placed a firm, heavy hand directly onto Richard's tailored shoulder, physically halting his upward momentum. From 100 feet away, I watched the pantomime unfold. Thomas leaned in close to Richard, ear contorting his face into a mask of deep, tragic sorrow. He shook his head slowly, putting on a masterful performance of a heartbroken patriarch protecting a vulnerable guest. I could not hear the audio, but I knew the exact script Thomas was deploying because he had rehearsed it for years. He was telling Richard that I was severely unstable. He was undoubtedly whispering that I was a lowly data entry clerk struggling with mental health issues, recently discharged from a rehabilitation facility. He was painting a picture of a fragile, broken woman who needed to be completely ignored for her own safety. Please do not approach her, Richard. It will only cause a scene and ruin my beautiful daughter's special day. I watched Richard face morph rapidly. The initial pleasant surprise of seeing a respected tech executive twisted into a tight knot of offended concern. He was a man who processed incoming data quickly. He was listening to Thomas spin a tragic tale about a mentally defective relative, completely unaware that the subject of the story held the administrative keys to his entire global wealth network. It was time to inject a dose of reality into the billionaire data stream. I slowly lowered my right hand, slipping it beneath the heavy ivory tablecloth. I retrieved my mobile device from my pocket, keeping the glowing screen carefully shielded against my thigh. I did not break visual contact with the head table as my thumb swiped across the glass, accessing my secure, encrypted directory. I pulled up the private contact profile for Richard Sterling. It was a direct line reserved exclusively for elite board members and critical security alerts. I typed out a highly specific message, ensuring every single word carried maximum tactical weight. Richard, it is Clara. Do not react to this message. Just wait for the slideshow. I pressed send and immediately locked the device, sliding it back into the darkness of my pocket. I kept my eyes fixed on the billionaire venture capitalist. 3 seconds later, I saw the subtle physical shift. Richard paused his conversation with Thomas as he felt the distinct vibration in his inner breast pocket. He was a man who never ignored a secure priority alert, maintaining a polite, neutral expression. Richard smoothly reached into his jacket. He withdrew his phone, keeping it low and discreetly angled beneath the edge of the elevated table. He glanced downward, his eyes scanning the brief sentence I had just transmitted. I watched the exact moment the realization struck him. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together inside his brilliant mind. The man standing next to him, aggressively smiling and playing the role of a loving, protective father, had just fed him a massive, deeply insulting lie about a highly respected corporate executive. Richard Sterling did not tolerate liars, and he absolutely despised being manipulated by inferior intellects. Richard slowly slid the phone back into his tailored pocket. He looked up, turning his head to stare directly into my father's aggressively fake-smiling face. He did not say a single word to Thomas. He simply reached out, removed the heavy, patronizing hand from his shoulder, and slowly sat back down in his chair. His expression hardened into a mask of absolute freezing ice. The social dynamic at the head table had fundamentally fractured, but my parents were completely oblivious to the danger. Susan raised her glass toward a photographer, flashing a brilliant artificial smile. Thomas settled back into his seat, looking incredibly relieved that he had successfully contained the imaginary threat. They genuinely believed their flawless illusion was still intact. They thought their scapegoat was safely neutralized in the shadows, and their billionaire investor was perfectly pacified. They had absolutely no idea that the execution command was already loaded. The audiovisual technician hidden inside the control booth was patiently waiting for my signal. The room buzzed with happy, oblivious chatter as the catering staff began clearing the appetizer plates. The ambient piano music slowly faded out, signaling the transition to the main event. The maid of honor confidently stepped up to the center stage microphone, completely unaware that she was about to pull the trigger on her best friend's entire fake existence. Which brings us right back to the precipice of the climax. The heavy crystal chandeliers illuminating the grand Alpine ballroom simultaneously extinguished, plunging the massive space into a sudden, dramatic darkness. A collective murmur of anticipation rustled through the 200 elite attendees. At the front of the room, the maid of honor stepped up to the center stage microphone. Her silk dress rustled softly against the wooden floorboards. She cleared her throat, her voice echoing through the state-of-the-art surround sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her tone brightly polished and rehearsed, "please direct your attention to the main display for a very special presentation honoring our beautiful bride and groom." High above the crowd, a heavy industrial projector booted up with a low mechanical hum. A brilliant beam of white light sliced through the darkened ballroom, striking the 15-foot vertical canvas suspended behind the head table. Gentle, playful piano music began to float from the hidden speakers, establishing a mood of innocent nostalgia. The visual presentation started out completely normal. It was a carefully curated timeline of manufactured perfection. The screen displayed a photograph of Harper as a toothless toddler wearing a pink ballet tutu. The audience let out a synchronized, quiet coo of adoration. The image dissolved smoothly into a picture of Julian as a teenager, holding a polished silver lacrosse trophy while wearing his prestigious private school uniform. A smattering of polite applause rippled through the front tables where the Sterling family sat. I sat motionless in the dark corner by the catering doors, watching the fabricated history unfold. The disconnect between the pristine images flashing on the canvas and the reality of the people depicting them was staggering. The crowd was applauding a young man who had just committed massive corporate espionage and a young woman who had proudly stolen $15,000 to buy a designer dress. The entire room was completely enchanted by a beautiful lie. The piano melody continued highlighting their early dating years. Harper and Julian posing at expensive vineyards. Harper and Julian smiling brightly on a chartered sailboat. The guests were entirely lulled into a false sense of sentimental security. Then the trap was officially sprung. The light-hearted piano music abruptly cut out. The sudden silence in the cavernous ballroom was instantly filled by the booming sound effect of a cartoonish drum roll. The background of the massive projection shifted from soft pastel colors to a stark, aggressive red. Bold white letters stamped aggressively across the display. "Let us meet the Black Sheep." The transition from polite romantic viewing to targeted public hostility was incredibly jarring. The audience fell dead silent, trying to process the sudden tonal shift. My face filled the 15-foot canvas. It was a photograph taken years ago, but it had been deliberately and maliciously altered. Someone had applied a hideous funhouse filter, stretching my jawline, magnifying my forehead, and dulling my eyes to make my features look grotesque and swollen. I looked like a cartoon monster staring down at the elegant crowd. A sharp metallic sound effect rang through the speakers, and the first label slammed onto the altered image right across my forehead. Divorcée. A few scattered pockets of nervous laughter broke the tension in the room. Some guests chuckled uncertainly, assuming this was an edgy modern roast dynamic. My parents were attacking my social viability, trying to frame my escape from an abusive marriage as a pathetic personal failure. The second label dropped, hitting the screen like a digital hammer. Broke. The laughter grew significantly louder. It was feeding on the toxic herd mentality that infects large crowds when permission is granted to mock an outsider. The irony was almost physically painful. They were calling me destitute while standing inside a luxury venue that I had personally funded through brutal extortion. Then the final label appeared. The letters were larger than the previous two, glowing with a menacing intensity. Barren. The 15-foot insult hung suspended in the dark air. The word broadcasted my deepest, most agonizing medical trauma to 200 complete strangers. It represented years of silent suffering, sterile clinic waiting rooms, and the ultimate destruction of my previous life. It was not a punchline. It was a profound, intimate grief that my own mother and father had decided to weaponize simply to entertain their wealthy friends. The laughter in the room began to falter as the sheer cruelty of the word registered with the more perceptive guests. But the silence that followed was not born of sympathy. It was the uncomfortable quiet of people realizing they were witnessing a public execution and not knowing where to look. At the elevated head table, Harper leaned forward and tapped her microphone. The sharp audio feedback drew all attention away from the screen and directly toward her radiant, smiling face. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the ambient light from the projector, scattering tiny prisms across the tablecloth. "Lighten up, Clara," she said into the microphone, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Do not have a meltdown and ruin my special day." Susan sat to the right of the bride. She raised her crystal wine glass, taking a slow, casual sip of her vintage Chardonnay. Her posture was relaxed, completely unbothered by the macabre spectacle she had helped orchestrate. She offered a slight patronizing smile to the crowd, as if to apologize for my existence. Thomas leaned back in his heavy wooden chair and chuckled loudly. He slapped his thigh, producing a booming sound that carried over the silent crowd. "Can you not take a simple joke, kiddo?" he called out into the darkness. 200 elite faces slowly turned away from the head table, pivoting to search the dark perimeter of the grand ballroom. They were actively scanning the shadows desperately, trying to locate the pathetic, broken woman designated as the punchline. They expected to see me shatter. They expected me to cover my face with trembling hands, burst into hysterical tears, and flee blindly through the swinging kitchen doors. This is the exact moment my family lived for, the absolute destruction of my dignity to elevate their own social standing. They needed the Sterling family to see me as a defective outcast, completely severed from their flawless lineage. I did not cover my face. I did not shed a single tear. I remained seated with my spine perfectly straight and my shoulders relaxed. I did not look at the 200 guests eagerly searching the dark for my humiliation. I looked entirely past them, focusing my vision directly on the front row of the head table. I looked directly at Richard Sterling. The billionaire venture capitalist was not laughing. He was not shifting uncomfortably. His face had transformed into a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated fury. His jaw was clenched so tightly the muscles fluttered visibly beneath his skin. His hands rested flat on the ivory tablecloth, gripping the edge with enough force to turn his knuckles bright white. Richard possessed a brilliant analytical mind, and he was currently processing the sheer depravity unfolding in front of him. He was a man who entrusted the security of his entire global empire to my architectural genius. He knew my work ethic. He knew my undeniable value. And he was currently watching a syndicate of intellectual parasites mock the very woman holding the keys to their financial survival. The absolute disgust radiating from his posture was palpable. The chessboard was fully illuminated. The opposing pieces had confidently marched themselves directly into the trap. It was time to clear the board. I looked down at the glowing rectangular device resting quietly in my palm. The secure messaging channel to Marcus was open and active. The single word required to authorize the digital strike was already typed into the command line. My thumb hovered millimeters above the glass interface. I took one final slow breath, inhaling the scent of roasted pine and expensive gardenias. Execute. I pressed send, and the 15-foot projector screen violently glitched, the cruel words melting instantly into scrolling lines of bright green binary code. The sudden digital glitch on the massive canvas was not a subtle flicker. It was a violent visual rupture. The hideous altered image of my face, along with the 3 cruel labels that my parents had designed to destroy me, violently tore apart. The pixels shredded into jagged, aggressive lines of bright neon green binary code that began scrolling rapidly downward, resembling digital rain pouring across the 15-foot screen. The playful, nostalgic piano music that had been piping through the venue speakers was instantly and brutally severed. The resulting silence in the cavernous ballroom was deafening, creating an immediate vacuum of tension. That silence was quickly replaced by a low, authoritative, mechanical hum. It was the distinct, powerful frequency of a high-capacity external routing server successfully booting up and taking absolute administrative control over the local network. At the elevated head table, Harper reacted with immediate aggressive annoyance. Her perfect moment of triumphant cruelty had been interrupted. She aggressively slapped the heavy metal microphone stand, sending a harsh pop of static audio feedback through the room. "Tech issues," she shrieked, her voice entirely stripped of its previous artificial sweetness. "Fix it immediately! Turn the slideshow back on right now!" She waved her hand frantically toward the back of the room, expecting the hired local staff to jump to her command. When the green code continued to scroll relentlessly across the screen, Tomas decided to intervene. He pushed his heavy chair backward and stood up, his face flushed with irritation. He was a man accustomed to bullying service workers into submission, and he assumed the audiovisual technician had simply made a clumsy mistake. He marched angrily away from the head table, striding aggressively down the central aisle toward the elevated tech booth located at the rear of the ballroom. His heavy dress shoes thumped loudly against the polished floorboards. As he approached the glass-enclosed booth, he raised his hand, preparing to pound his fist against the door and demand immediate compliance. Thomas never made contact with the glass. He stopped abruptly, his hand hovering in midair. Standing inside the booth, fully illuminated by the glow of 3 separate tactical monitors, was Marcus. My chief operating officer was not wearing a standard venue uniform. He was dressed in a sharp black tactical polo shirt featuring the WestGrid cyber emblem subtly embroidered on the chest. He was leaning casually against the main control console, his arms crossed over his chest. Marcus looked directly at Thomas through the reinforced glass barrier. He did not look panicked. He did not look apologetic. He simply offered my father a very polite, exceedingly pleasant smile. Thomas grabbed the heavy metal handle of the booth door and yanked it violently. It did not budge. Marcus had engaged the internal magnetic deadbolt, locking himself securely inside the fortress. He was completely untouchable. A sharp digital chime echoed through the surround sound speakers, pulling the attention of every single guest, including my frustrated father, away from the booth and back toward the massive projector screen at the front of the room. The scrolling green binary code stabilized and snapped cleanly out of existence. The canvas was no longer displaying my warped, humiliated face. Instead, the screen was filled by a massive, high-definition corporate logo. The interlocking geometric shapes of the WestGrid cyber emblem glowed with pristine professional authority. It was an image synonymous with elite data protection and ruthless digital efficiency. The logo held the screen for exactly 3 seconds before smoothly fading out. It was immediately replaced by a crystal-clear, high-resolution image. It was a full-page feature spread from a recent issue of Forbes magazine, specifically the prestigious 30 Under 30 Technology Edition. The photograph featured me. I was not wearing a garish neon yellow polyester sack or hiding behind a stone pillar. I was wearing a sharply tailored navy blue executive suit. I was standing confidently with my arms crossed directly in front of the massive glass and steel architecture of my corporate headquarters in Boulder. I looked powerful, composed, and entirely in control of my empire. Beneath the stunning photograph, the bold white caption was impossible to misinterpret. Clara West, founder and chief executive officer. Current valuation, $45 million. The atmosphere inside the Grand Alpine Ballroom shifted instantaneously. The collective murmurs that rippled through the 200 elite attendees completely changed frequency. The cruel, amused chuckles that had previously filled the air evaporated instantly. They were replaced by sounds of profound, utter confusion and rapid, frantic whispering. Wealthy investors and socialites leaned into each other, desperately trying to reconcile the pathetic, broken narrative they had just been fed with the undeniable corporate reality currently towering over them. Not a deadbeat. My voice cut through the chaotic whispering. I did not yell. I did not scream. I spoke at a completely normal conversational volume, but the acoustics of the silent room amplified my words, carrying them clearly to every single corner of the massive space. I stood up, slowly pushing the uncomfortable wooden chair away from the catering doors. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal suit. I stepped away from table 18, abandoning the physical manifestation of my family isolation forever. I am a CEO, I stated, walking steadily forward into the light. I did not march aggressively toward the stage. I strolled with the measured, deliberate pacing of an executive entering a hostile boardroom negotiation. Every head in the room swiveled to track my movement. The guests sitting near the outer perimeter instinctively pushed their chairs backward, creating a wide physical path for me to walk through. The energy in the room had fundamentally inverted. I was no longer the prey. I was the apex predator, and the hunt had officially commenced. At the back of the room, Thomas was experiencing a total catastrophic mental breakdown. The illusion he had spent years meticulously constructing was incinerating right in front of his eyes. He realized he could not intimidate the man locked inside the tech booth, so he resorted to brute force panic. He frantically scanned the wall outside the booth, locating the thick, black industrial power cable that supplied electricity to the overhead projector unit. With a guttural grunt of desperation, Thomas lunged forward and grabbed the heavy cord, wrapping both hands around the thick rubber casing. He planted his feet firmly on the carpet and yanked violently, attempting to rip the plug straight out of the wall socket and plunge the room back into darkness. The heavy cord popped out of the wall socket and hit the floor with a loud slap. Thomas let out a loud, breathless sigh of relief, expecting the massive canvas at the front of the room to immediately go black. He wiped his sweating forehead, preparing to spin a new lie about a terrible hacking incident. The bright beam of the projector did not even flicker. The image of my Forbes cover remained glowing vibrantly on the screen, illuminating his failure for the entire room to witness. Thomas stared at the unplugged cable lying uselessly on the carpet, his jaw dropping in sheer, uncomprehending horror. Inside the booth, Marcus simply tapped the glass lightly to get my father's attention. When Thomas looked up, Marcus pointed a single finger downward toward the floor. My chief operating officer was a former military intelligence analyst. He did not rely on standard venue infrastructure during a hostile operation. Hours before the reception began, Marcus had completely bypassed the local wall circuits. He had discreetly routed the primary power supply for the entire projection array into an independent, high-capacity battery backup unit, securely locked inside the booth. The local power grid was completely irrelevant. Thomas had just unplugged a dead wire. My father stood frozen at the back of the room, holding the useless piece of rubber, realizing with absolute, terrifying clarity that the only possible way to stop the presentation now would be to physically tear the building down around us. The digital execution could not be halted, and the ammunition I was about to display was far more devastating than a simple magazine cover. I continued my slow, deliberate pace toward the exact geographic center of the Grand Alpine Ballroom. The physical space around me felt profoundly different now. The oppressive, radiant heat from the catering kitchen had faded away, replaced by the cool, conditioned air circulating beneath the massive crystal chandeliers. My leather heels clicked rhythmically against the polished wooden dance floor. Each step sounded like a heavy wooden gavel striking a judicial block. I did not rush. I did not sprint. I moved with the precise, measured confidence of a seasoned corporate prosecutor approaching a jury box, holding undeniable, absolute proof of guilt. The 200 attendees remained completely frozen in their seats. Their eyes tracked my every movement with fascinated horror. The polite rustling of expensive silk dresses and the soft clinking of silver cutlery had ceased entirely. The atmosphere inside the room felt incredibly thin, as if the sudden influx of raw truth had consumed all the available oxygen. I stopped squarely in the middle of the dance floor, planting my feet firmly on the polished wood. I turned my body to directly face the elevated bridal dais. Susan was staring down at me with wide, terrified eyes, her carefully constructed social mask melting away to reveal the frightened manipulator underneath. Harper was gripping the edge of the thick ivory tablecloth so tightly her knuckles were turning a stark bone white. Thomas was still trapped at the back of the room, standing helplessly next to the locked audiovisual booth, breathing heavily like a cornered animal. I did not raise my voice to a frantic shout. I projected my words from my diaphragm, utilizing the exact, authoritative boardroom cadence I relied upon when dismantling hostile corporate acquisitions. "Slide 3, I commanded. Behind me, the massive 15-foot canvas instantly transitioned. The stunning Forbes magazine cover vanished in a blink. In its place appeared a razor-sharp, high-resolution screenshot. It was the digital photograph I had captured exactly 4 weeks ago inside the Denver General Hospital cafeteria, while my mother complained about her coffee syrup. The text messages from the group chat titled The A-Team loomed over the entire reception. The font was blown up to massive proportions, making the black text bubbles impossible for anyone in the room to ignore. "Let us review your private family communications," I stated, my voice echoing evenly across the silent ballroom. "Harper, you asked if the gullible cash cow was coming to the hospital. Mom, you replied that your fake heart palpitation act worked perfectly and that I would definitely attend this wedding. Dad, you concluded the strategy session by demanding the slideshow completely bury me so the Sterling family would never associate my perceived failures with your flawless lineage." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the assembled crowd. It was the distinct sound of high society realizing they were witnessing unvarnished, premeditated cruelty. Elite circles operate on polite fictions and quiet indiscretions, but seeing such vicious manipulation displayed in high definition was deeply shocking, even to them. At the head table, the blood entirely drained from Susan's face, leaving her looking gray and remarkably hollow. Her fingers went completely limp. The crystal wine glass she had been holding slipped seamlessly from her grasp. It plummeted downward and struck the polished parquet floor. The glass shattered violently, sending sharp, transparent shards and pale yellow Chardonnay exploding across the pristine wood. The sharp, sudden sound of breaking crystal punctuated the heavy silence perfectly. I did not give them a single second to recover their composure. I kept the tactical pressure absolute. Slide 4, I commanded without looking back at the screen. The visual shifted instantaneously. The deeply incriminating text messages disappeared, replaced by highly sensitive official banking documents. The routing numbers, transaction timestamps, and account holder details were highlighted in bright red digital boxes for maximum visibility. "Dad!" I called out, projecting my voice toward the rear of the ballroom where Thomas was still standing in defeated shock. "3 months ago, you extorted $50,000 from me. You explicitly claimed the money was urgently required to secure the deposit for this exact Aspen venue. You threatened to destroy the only remaining digital audio recordings of my deceased grandfather if I refused to comply with your demand." Another wave of frantic murmurs washed over the crowd. The specific word, extorted, hung heavy and dangerous in the air. But as everyone in this room can clearly see, I continued gesturing toward the massive screen behind me. That substantial wire transfer never went to a hospitality vendor. The funds bypassed the resort entirely and were deposited directly into a ghost limited liability corporation, a hidden holding account legally registered to Julian Sterling. I shifted my focus back to the bridal dais. Harper, jaw dropped open in a display of genuine, unscripted shock. She turned her head slowly to stare at her new husband. She had been operating under the arrogant assumption that Julian was a wealthy tech visionary, independently funding his own lavish lifestyle. Discovering that her flawless groom was quietly absorbing extorted cash stolen from her despised older sister shattered her carefully constructed delusion. Julian aggressively refused to look at her. His face was glistening with nervous sweat, and his eyes darted around the room looking for an exit. The structural integrity of their fake empire was rapidly crumbling, but the foundation needed to be completely pulverized. I stated, my voice remaining impeccably calm and detached. The massive projector canvas flashed again. A new set of financial transaction records appeared. This document was much more recent, featuring a timestamp from exactly 4 hours prior. It detailed a rapid routing sequence, displaying money moving from a domestic checking account through a digital tumbling service and ultimately landing in a private offshore banking application. I looked directly into my sister's horrified eyes. "This morning, Harper, you orchestrated a deeply hysterical performance inside my hotel suite. You claimed your premium florist had unexpectedly canceled because a $15,000 payment had mysteriously bounced. You threw a heavy velvet pillow at my head when I firmly refused to hand over my personal corporate credit card to cover the fabricated emergency." The wealthy guests were now leaning forward in their chairs, completely captivated by the forensic brutality of the presentation. They were watching a high society illusion being dissected with surgical precision. "There was no canceled florist," I explained, letting the undeniable truth sink deep into the room. "Your original payment never bounced. You deliberately routed $15,000 of our father's money directly into your own hidden offshore account. And according to the digital receipt currently displayed on the screen, you utilized those stolen funds to purchase a custom haute couture designer dress from Paris, intended exclusively for your late-night after-party." The absolute paralysis inside the ballroom was total. 200 elite attendees sat entirely frozen. The wealthy, loving, respectable family they had been invited to celebrate had been fully exposed as a pathetic, desperate syndicate of grifters, liars, and thieves. The beautiful floral centerpieces, the expensive ice sculptures, and the flowing vintage champagne suddenly felt like cheap props in a criminal stage play. I stood alone in the center of the dance floor, the absolute master of the environment. I had not yelled. I had not shed a tear. I had simply turned on the bright fluorescent lights and allowed the roaches to scatter. The suffocating silence held for 5 agonizing seconds before the pressure finally broke the weakest link in the chain. Julian Sterling could no longer tolerate the humiliating exposure. His fabricated identity as a brilliant Silicon Valley visionary was currently burning to the ground in front of his wealthy parents and their influential network. He pushed his heavy chair backwards so aggressively it toppled over and crashed onto the floor behind him. He jumped up from the head table, his face a chaotic mixture of panic and furious desperation. He pointed a trembling, sweating finger directly at my face. "She is hacking us," Julian screamed, his voice cracking wildly under the intense emotional strain. He looked frantically around the room, trying to rally the crowd to his defense. "Do not listen to her. This is all completely fake. She fabricated these documents because she is a jealous, unhinged psycho. It is a massive cyber attack." He was flailing, grasping at invisible straws, trying to construct a final, desperate lie to salvage his ruined reputation. He thought if he yelled loud enough, the elite audience might actually believe his ridiculous narrative. But Julian was entirely foolish. He was directing his pathetic rage at me, completely unaware of the shifting tectonic plates occurring mere inches away from him. He thought I was the primary threat in the room. He was drastically underestimating the situation, because the real danger inside that grand ballroom had not even spoken a single syllable yet. And when the billionaire venture capitalist finally decided to break his silence, the resulting devastation would leave absolutely nothing behind. Julian continued to shout desperate accusations from the elevated dais, his voice echoing shrilly across the silent room. He pointed his trembling finger at the massive projection screen, calling the financial documents forged fabrications and demanding that someone physically remove me from the venue. He was entirely consumed by his own panicked performance. He completely failed to notice the subtle, yet deeply ominous movement occurring directly to his left. Richard Sterling placed both of his large hands flat against the edge of the heavy ivory tablecloth. With a slow, powerful, and deliberate motion, he pushed himself upward. When a billionaire venture capitalist stands up in a room full of people desperate for his financial favor, the entire atmosphere fundamentally alters. The ambient energy inside the Grand Alpine Ballroom instantly deferred to his immense gravity. The scattered, frantic whispers among the elite guests immediately died out. The attendees, who had been shifting nervously in their seats, froze in place. Even the catering staff standing near the swinging kitchen doors stopped moving, holding their breath. Richard did not look at Julian. He completely ignored his son's hysterical flailing, treating him like an irrelevant child throwing a meaningless tantrum. Instead, Richard turned his body away from the bridal party and stepped gracefully off the elevated platform. His custom-tailored navy blazer fell perfectly into place as he walked with measured, absolute authority toward the back of the room. He walked directly toward my father. Thomas was still standing near the locked audiovisual booth, clutching the useless rubber power cord he had ripped from the wall. When he saw Richard approaching, his eyes widened in sheer, unfiltered terror. He dropped the black cable onto the carpet and instinctively took a small, pathetic half-step backward until his shoulder blades bumped against the reinforced glass of the control booth. He was a trapped animal watching the apex predator slowly close the distance. Richard stopped exactly 3 feet away from Thomas. The physical proximity was intensely aggressive. He did not raise his voice to match Julian's frantic shouting. He spoke in a tone that was deathly quiet. It was the terrifying, controlled stillness of an executive who was preparing to permanently dismantle a career. Thomas Richard began, his voice carrying a lethal, icy precision that cut through the silent ballroom. "You stood directly next to me 20 minutes ago. You placed your hand on my shoulder. You looked me directly in my eyes, and you explicitly told me that your daughter was a mentally unstable data entry clerk. You claimed she was a fragile liability who needed to be completely ignored for her own safety." Thomas opened his mouth to speak. His jaw worked up and down, but no actual sound emerged. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his exposure. The fabricated narrative he had relied upon for 6 years was disintegrating under the crushing weight of billionaire scrutiny. Richard did not wait for an excuse. He slowly rotated his broad shoulders, turning his back on Thomas and addressing the 200 stunned guests sitting motionless at their tables. Clara West is not a lowly data entry clerk, Richard announced, his booming voice projecting massive, undeniable authority across the room. She is the founder and chief executive officer of one of the most elite security firms in the country. Just last Tuesday, Clara personally stood inside my corporate boardroom and successfully finalized the encrypted architectural matrix safeguarding my firm's entire $100 million offshore financial portfolio. She is brilliant, she is ruthless, and she is currently protecting the exact generational wealth that half the people in this room desperately want a piece of. The wealthy attendees absorbed the information like a physical shockwave. The revelation fundamentally rewired their entire understanding of the social dynamics they had just witnessed. They realized they had been laughing at a woman who held the administrative keys to the most powerful financial network in the state. The nervous glances darting around the room transformed from confusion to profound embarrassment and deep anxiety. They had actively participated in the mockery of an apex predator, and they were terrified of the potential corporate consequences. Up at the head table, another figure rose to their feet. Victoria Sterling stood up, her posture rigid with aristocratic fury. Her beautiful face was flushed a deep, angry red. She ignored the murmuring crowd and turned her fierce attention entirely onto the groom. Julian Victoria demanded, her voice snapping across the platform like a physical whip. Julian flinched, instantly silencing his frantic shouts about hacking and forgery. He slowly lowered his pointing finger and looked at his mother. The false bravado he had displayed during his vows completely vanished, leaving behind a deeply frightened, deeply arrogant boy. "Did you steal $50,000 from this woman?" Victoria asked. Her tone did not invite an excuse. It demanded an absolute confession. Julian stammered heavily, his eyes darting frantically toward Harper, who was still staring at him in horrified betrayal. "Mom, you do not understand," he pleaded, sweat visibly beading on his forehead. "The money was just a temporary bridge loan. It was strictly for the startup development costs. I was going to pay it back after the massive Series A funding round cleared next month. It was just a standard business maneuver." He was trying to deploy his familiar Silicon Valley buzzwords, hoping the corporate jargon would mask the underlying felony. He believed his parents would view the theft as a ruthless but ultimately acceptable entrepreneurial strategy. Richard Sterling turned his head, pivoting away from the paralyzed crowd to look directly at his sweating son. The absolute disgust radiating from the billionaire patriarch was staggering. The startup based entirely on stolen intellectual property, Ricard asked, his voice dripping with lethal condescension. Julian physically recoiled as if he had been struck across the face. His mouth hung open, a silent gasp of pure shock escaping his lips. He had genuinely believed his massive corporate espionage was a perfectly guarded secret. He thought he had brilliantly outsmarted the entire technology sector. He never expected his own father to drag his felony out into the bright light of a public wedding reception. Yes, Julian Richard continued delivering the final, devastating blow with surgical precision. "Clara briefed my entire executive board regarding your little felony yesterday afternoon. You stole proprietary algorithms from a bankrupt competitor, slapped your own pathetic branding over the interface, and tried to pitch that stolen code to our largest logistical client. You are not a tech visionary. You are a common thief and a walking legal liability." The silence inside the Grand Alpine Ballroom deepened, taking on a heavy, suffocating quality. The Sterling family, the absolute pinnacle of Colorado high society, realized in real time that they were not celebrating a prestigious union of powerful lineages. They were officially marrying into a pathetic, deeply toxic syndicate of grifters. The wealthy parents recognized the severe structural damage. Julian was a corporate criminal. Harper was a shallow thief who routed family funds to offshore accounts for designer dresses. Thomas was an extortionist who manipulated billionaires. Susan was a shallow, vanity-obsessed enabler. The entire West family, excluding the CEO standing calmly in the center of the dance floor, was fundamentally radioactive. The elite crowd watched the implosion with horrified fascination. The pristine aspen wedding, the crystal chandeliers, the vintage champagne, and the towering ice sculptures. It was all a hollow, beautiful facade, masking deep, rotting corruption underneath. Richard Sterling let the absolute magnitude of his son's failure hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment. He looked at Julian. He looked at Thomas, shivering against the glass booth. And finally, he looked at me, offering a single, subtle nod of profound professional respect. I had not just exposed a family drama. I had successfully protected his corporate empire from a massive legal disaster. And he recognized the sheer tactical brilliance of the execution. Then Richard reached inside his custom-tailored navy blazer. He smoothly withdrew a long, slender leather checkbook from his interior pocket. He held it in his right hand, slowly clicking a heavy silver pen using his left thumb. The wealthy guests watched the movement with intense curiosity. They assumed the billionaire was preparing to write a massive dramatic check, perhaps attempting to financially reimburse me for the extorted $50,000 right there on the dance floor, in a display of ultimate alpha male dominance. But Richard Sterling was not reaching for his leather checkbook to write a generous wedding gift or settle a petty family debt. He was a venture capitalist. He only deployed financial instruments to completely sever toxic liabilities and secure his remaining assets. The final destruction of the golden couple was about to be officially formalized in blue ink. Richard held the silver pen suspended over his leather checkbook for exactly 2 seconds. He was allowing the sheer weight of his impending financial decision to fully permeate the silent ballroom. He looked directly at Julian, who was standing on the elevated platform, his face glistening with cold, nervous sweat. The young man was practically vibrating with desperate anticipation, hoping his powerful father was about to deploy a massive influx of capital to somehow smooth over the catastrophic legal exposure. Julian genuinely believed his elite surname granted him total immunity from consequence. He was entirely mistaken. The Sterling Family Trust is permanently closed to you, Julian Richard announced, his voice echoing loudly with absolute finality. I am completely freezing your access to all corporate holding accounts effective immediately. You are a legal liability, and I will not allow your pathetic felonies to infect my enterprise. Richard snapped the leather checkbook shut with a sharp, dismissive crack. He slid the silver pen back into his interior pocket. This wedding is officially over, he stated, turning his back on the bridal dais and addressing his bewildered wife. Victoria, gather your belongings. We are leaving right now. The billionaire matriarch did not argue. She picked up her silk clutch, casting one final look of pure aristocratic disgust at her terrified son before stepping off the elevated platform to join her husband. They began walking gracefully toward the main exit, their posture radiating absolute, untouchable authority. The withdrawal of their powerful presence removed the final structural pillar supporting the fabricated family empire. The resulting fallout was instantaneous, chaotic, and breathtakingly violent. The Golden family, stripped of their wealthy benefactors and completely exposed to the elite crowd, instantly turned on each other like starved, desperate animals trapped inside a collapsing cage. Julian shattered first. The realization that his generational wealth had just evaporated, leaving him completely exposed to federal prosecution for corporate espionage, broke his fragile psyche. He spun violently toward Harper, his face contorted into a mask of ugly, unfiltered rage. "You ruined everything," he screamed, leaning aggressively over the heavy ivory tablecloth. He pointed an accusatory finger directly at his radiant bride. "You specifically told me she was a broke, pathetic loser. You said she was an irrelevant data clerk. You completely ruined my Series A funding. The entire pitch meeting is completely dead because you could not control your psychotic, jealous obsession with your own sister." Harper recoiled, physically shrinking backward in her heavy silk gown. The charming, sophisticated persona she had maintained for years dissolved completely. She shrieked back at him, her voice ascending into a shrill, hysterical pitch. "Do not dare blame this on me, Julian," she yelled, gesturing frantically toward the massive projection screen that was still displaying the damning financial records. "You are the one who stole the intellectual property. You are the fraudulent tech visionary. You took the $50,000 from my father and funneled it into your pathetic shell company. You are a completely broke con artist." The toxic, symbiotic relationship they had built upon mutual deception was incinerating rapidly. They had bonded over their shared arrogance and mutual contempt for me. But the moment true adversity struck, their loyalty vanished instantly. Harper spun aggressively away from her new husband, searching for another target to absorb her massive humiliation. Her wild eyes landed squarely on Susan, who was still sitting, frozen in her chair, staring blankly at the shattered wineglass pooled on the parquet floor. "This is your fault," Harper shrieked, directing her venom entirely onto her mother. "You promised me the floral scam was completely foolproof. You told me we could squeeze another $15,000 out of her without any consequences. You orchestrated that pathetic fake heart attack to guarantee she attended this reception. You literally wrote the script for my complete destruction." Susan flinched, blinking rapidly as if she were waking up from a deep, traumatic trance. She raised her trembling hands defensively, attempting to deflect the vicious verbal assault from her favorite child. "I was only trying to help you, Harper," Susan cried, her voice cracking under the intense emotional strain. "I wanted you to have the beautiful, perfect day you deserved. I did everything for you. I pawned the antique urn. I sent the texts. I played the loving mother. I gave you everything." The raw, unfiltered display of deep familial toxicity was deeply disturbing to watch. The 200 wealthy guests sat completely paralyzed, captivated by the sheer, unadulterated madness unfolding on the elevated dais. The elegant string quartet had entirely abandoned their instruments, standing near the ice sculptures, watching the absolute carnage in stunned silence. At the back of the room, Tomas was experiencing a profoundly different kind of breakdown. He was not interested in screaming accusations at his wife or his daughter. He was entirely focused on the immediate source of his total humiliation: me. He had lost his billionaire investor. He had lost his $50,000. He had lost his pristine country club reputation. He had lost his complete, absolute authority. And he blamed me entirely for tearing down the fake walls of his kingdom. Thomas lost the last remaining shred of his fabricated patriarchal dignity. He let out a guttural, animalistic roar of pure, blind fury. His face flushed, a terrifying shade of dark purple, contrasting violently against his white-collared shirt. He abandoned his position near the locked audiovisual booth and lunged aggressively forward. He charged down the central aisle, his heavy dress shoes pounding loudly against the polished floorboards. He was sprinting directly toward the geographic center of the dance floor, where I stood, completely motionless. His thick arms were outstretched, his fingers curled into desperate, grasping claws. He fully intended to physically attack me. He wanted to violently rip the mobile device from my hand and hurl it against the wall, erroneously believing that destroying the physical hardware would somehow magically erase the devastating truth glowing on the 15-foot screen behind me. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I did not raise my arms in a defensive posture. I simply stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight and my expression entirely neutral. I knew exactly what was about to happen. Thomas never made physical contact. He never even came within 5 feet of my tailored charcoal suit. Richard Sterling was a billionaire who operated heavily within the global technology sector. He understood the severe physical risks associated with elite corporate acquisitions. He never traveled to a public event without an invisible, highly trained security apparatus operating smoothly in the background. 2 massive men dressed in impeccably tailored dark suits materialized completely seamlessly from the shadows near the catering kitchen doors. They moved with terrifying, silent speed, intercepted my charging father with flawless tactical precision. The first security operative stepped smoothly between me and Thomas, acting as an immovable concrete wall. The second operative grabbed Thomas by his thick shoulders and shoved him backward with a massive burst of calculated kinetic force. The impact lifted my father completely off his feet. Thomas flew backward through the air, his arms flailing wildly. He crashed violently into a tall cocktail table positioned near the edge of the dance floor. The heavy table collapsed under his significant weight. A towering pyramid of delicate crystal champagne flutes erupted into the air, raining down around him in a spectacular cascade of shattering glass and spraying vintage wine. The deafening crash echoed violently through the grand Alpine ballroom. Thomas lay groaning on the carpeted floor, completely covered in sticky alcohol and jagged transparent shards, struggling pathetically to regain his breath. The pristine, sophisticated Aspen wedding reception had completely devolved into a screaming, chaotic, glass-shattering, physical brawl right in front of Colorado elite society. The wealthy guests were now actively scrambling out of their chairs, pulling their designer coats tightly around their shoulders, eager to escape the radioactive blast radius of the West family implosion. I stood, perfectly still, in the center of the wreckage, completely untouched by the madness swirling around me. I looked at Harper sobbing hysterically at the head table. I looked at Julian pacing, frantically shouting into his cell phone. I looked at Susan staring blankly at her shattered reality. And finally, I looked at Thomas, lying defeated in a pool of broken champagne flutes. They had spent years constructing a beautiful, elaborate stage specifically designed for my ultimate public execution. They had polished the pebbles of cruelty, orchestrated the financial extortion, and weaponized my deepest personal traumas to entertain their wealthy friends. They had demanded my presence simply so they could push me into the dirt. But the scapegoat does not ever need to throw a physical punch. She never needs to scream or cry or match their pathetic emotional theatrics. She just needs to walk directly into the center of the dark room, turn on the blinding fluorescent lights, and watch the roaches scatter frantically back into the shadows. The execution was officially complete. The empire was completely reduced to ash. Now there was absolutely nothing left for me to do but walk away from the smoldering ruins and never look back. The collapse of the West family empire did not happen in slow motion. It occurred with the rapid, violent intensity of a demolished skyscraper. The wealthy guests who had previously sipped vintage wine and laughed at my altered photograph were now practically sprinting toward the cloakroom. Elite society possesses a ruthless survival instinct. They immediately recognized the radioactive nature of the situation and frantically scrambled to distance themselves from the blast radius. I stood perfectly still amidst the fleeing crowd. The ambient noise inside the grand ballroom was a chaotic symphony of destruction. I could hear the crunch of shattered crystal beneath the leather shoes of escaping attendees. I heard Julian shouting expletives at a caterer who accidentally bumped his shoulder. I heard the wet, pathetic groans of my father as he struggled to sit upright in a puddle of spilled champagne. I did not offer him a hand. I did not even glance in his direction. Thomas was no longer a towering, patriarchal figure wielding financial ultimatums. He was simply a defeated man, drenched in sticky alcohol, completely neutralized by his own supreme arrogance. My attention shifted away from the broken glass and focused entirely on the elevated dais. The head table resembled a tragic historical painting. Harper sat completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the massive projection screen that still displayed the undeniable proof of her greed. Her perfect bridal facade was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, vacant expression of a woman who had just realized her future was completely erased. Next to her, Susan was sobbing hysterically. Her mascara ran down her cheeks in thick, dark streams, staining her expensive silk collar. She buried her face into her trembling hands, her shoulders shaking violently with each dramatic gasp. But I knew my mother intimately. I knew those were not tears of genuine remorse or maternal regret. She was not weeping because she had profoundly betrayed her eldest daughter. She was crying because her carefully constructed social reputation had just been publicly executed. She was mourning the permanent loss of her country club invitations and her elite status. I began walking slowly toward the stage. My charcoal suit felt like lightweight armor moving seamlessly with my steady strides. The remaining caterers parted wordlessly, allowing me to pass. They looked at me with a mixture of fear and profound respect. I climbed the 3 carpeted steps leading onto the bridal platform. Harper flinched as I approached, pressing her spine hard against the back of her chair, but I did not acknowledge her presence. I walked directly over to Susan and stopped right beside her untouched dinner plate. My mother slowly lowered her hands. Her eyes were bloodshot and swollen. She looked up at me, expecting perhaps a final screaming match or a vicious verbal berating. She braced herself for an argument, because an argument would imply that I still cared enough to fight. I had absolutely no intention of fighting. The war was already won. I unlatched the brass clasp of my leather briefcase. I reached deep inside the spacious interior compartment. My fingers brushed against a thick bundle of cheap synthetic fabric. Before leaving my hotel suite earlier that morning, I had meticulously folded the garish neon yellow polyester dress Susan had attempted to force upon me during the rehearsal dinner. I had brought it to the venue for one highly specific reason. I pulled the ugly garment out of my bag. The harsh fabric caught the glow of the overhead chandeliers, reflecting a sickly bright hue. It represented every single attempt my parents had made to shrink me, to hide me, and to mold me into their convenient, pathetic scapegoat. I held the dress suspended in the air for a brief moment, ensuring Susan recognized exactly what I was holding. A fresh wave of silent horror washed over her streaked face. I did not throw it at her. I simply opened my hand and let gravity do the work. The oversized yellow sack dropped squarely onto her pristine porcelain dinner plate. The cheap material covered her untouched roasted lamb and knocked over a silver butter knife with a dull clatter. "Keep the change," I said. My voice was completely devoid of anger. It held the flat, detached finality of a corporate executive concluding a highly successful but incredibly tedious transaction. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on the weeping matriarch and walked down the steps of the dais. I marched straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, heading directly toward the heavy wooden exit doors. I did not look back at the 15-foot projection screen. I did not look at the shattered cocktail tables. I left the wreckage entirely behind me. I pushed through the main entrance of the luxury resort and stepped out into the crisp, snowy Aspen night. The contrast was absolutely breathtaking. The air outside was freezing clean and incredibly sharp. It smelled intensely of frozen pine needles and untouched winter earth. I took a massive, deep breath, filling my lungs with the freezing oxygen. A profound physical release washed over my entire body. The heavy, suffocating tension I had carried in my shoulders for 34 years instantly evaporated. The invisible chains tying me to their toxic demands were permanently severed. Standing next to a sleek, black, armored SUV in the valet roundabout was Marcus. My chief operating officer had already evacuated the tech booth and secured our digital perimeter. He was leaning casually against the vehicle, holding 2 steaming cups of dark coffee. He handed me one of the paper cups as I approached. We did not exchange dramatic high fives or shout victorious cheers. We were professionals who had just successfully neutralized a severe threat to our enterprise. "Payload delivered effectively?" I asked, taking a sip of the bitter hot liquid. "Total systemic wipeout," Marcus replied, his face illuminated briefly by the headlights of a fleeing guest vehicle. "The targets are completely neutralized." We climbed into the warm interior of the SUV and drove smoothly down the mountain, leaving the burning empire far behind us in the dark. Small towns and elite circles operate on the exact same principle. They survive on gossip, and they punish exposure. The fallout over the next 30 days was spectacular, swift, and entirely merciless. Julian Sterling proved himself to be the ultimate coward. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to protect whatever tiny fraction of his inheritance remained untouched by his father's wrath, he officially annulled the marriage less than 48 hours after the reception. He abandoned Harper completely, leaving her to face the furious floral vendors and the unpaid resort management entirely alone. She was forced to sell her Paris designer dress at a massive loss just to avoid severe civil litigation. Thomas faced a significantly darker fate. Richard Sterling was not a man who forgave manipulation lightly. True to his ruthless reputation, the billionaire venture capitalist made a single strategic phone call to his legal connections within the federal government. He explicitly reported the fraudulent shell company Thomas had utilized to funnel the extorted venue deposit. Within 2 weeks, the Internal Revenue Service launched an aggressive, comprehensive audit into my father's entire financial history. Agents froze his primary banking accounts, seized his assets, and began dismantling his shady business practices. The fake country club facade he had worshipped for decades was replaced by the terrifying reality of impending federal indictment. Susan found herself entirely exiled. The wealthy socialites who used to attend her lavish Sunday brunches instantly blocked her phone number. She became a total pariah within the Denver suburbs, completely ostracized by the very people she had destroyed her own daughter to impress. As for me, I returned to my headquarters in Boulder. The Monday morning following the Aspen incident, I walked into my corner office and found a massive arrangement of rare white orchids sitting on my desk. The attached card bore a very familiar minimalist corporate seal. "Flawless execution," the note read, signed simply with the letter R. Word of my ruthless efficiency spread quickly through the highest echelons of the tech industry. Corporate boards love an architect who can detect a massive threat and eliminate it with zero collateral damage to the client. Within a single month, WestGrid Cyber signed 3 new massive international contracts. Our overall corporate valuation surged upward by a staggering 15%. I bought a new house, nestled deep in the mountains, surrounded by tall, silent pines. I adopted a golden retriever rescue puppy and named him Copper. You do not ever have to absorb the poison of a family that views your emotional destruction as their personal entertainment. You do not owe your loyalty to people who treat your generosity like a weakness to be exploited. Blood does not give anyone the right to use your soul as a stepping stone for their own vanity. If you are sitting in the dark right now, feeling completely overwhelmed by the manipulative tactics of the people who are supposed to love you, I need you to understand your own power. Set your boundaries like solid, concrete walls. Keep your receipts safely organized in the shadows. Build your independence quietly and brilliantly. Let them underestimate you. Let them believe they hold all the cards. And when they finally hand you the microphone on the stage they built for your failure, make sure you know exactly what to say. If this story resonated with your own survival journey, drop a 1 in the comments right now and hit that subscribe button to join the Luke Vengeance community. I will be sharing another operation very soon that will make you completely rethink everything you know about corporate loyalty and false friends. Until next time, hold your ground, keep your data secure, and always protect your peace.